right. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of The Ken Show. My name is Corey DeVos. I'm joined, as always, by Ken Wilbur. Ken, how you doing today, man?
Good, my friend.
Good. This is going to be another killer show. So I thought what we would do today, Ken, is we've spent the last several episodes talking about sort of what's been happening politically, culturally, socially around this country and around the world. And we've been discussing in particular sort of this massive regression that we've been seeing in both parties, in both the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And, you know, after doing the last few episodes together, where we've been, you know, I think doing a really good job of laying down a very useful groundwork that we can use to carry these conversations forward, I thought today what we would do is spend a little bit of time trying to separate some of the virtues of liberalism in particular from some of its vices, basically, you know, saving the baby while flushing the bathwater away. And hopefully we can do this in a way that can, you know, point the way towards a more healthy liberalism, as well as to a more integral approach to politics and governance in general. So today I've highlighted 5 topics that are, you know, really near and dear to the liberal heart. And each of these 5 issues, I think, has been really corrupted in a lot of ways by the regressive elements that we've been talking about, both on the left and on the right. And I've tried to, you know, basically arrange these issues in such a way that we can kind of build on, each point can build on the last as we go through this. So again, I thought what we would do is take a look at some of these issues one by one. We can identify basically the healthy green versions that we'd most like to include in a more integral embrace, and eliminate the unhealthy regressive amber versions that, you know, so many of these have devolved into, particularly over the last couple of years. And then what we could do is basically offer a more integral approach to each of these points. So does that sound good to you?
You bet.
Awesome. Well, the first piece that we're going to talk about today is inclusivity and tolerance,
Right.
which has got to be one of the biggest buzzwords, particularly in liberal culture. You know, liberals really like to think of themselves as the party of tolerance and inclusion, the big tent party. And, you know, they've got this like massive index of all these intersectional identities that it uses to basically prove how radically inclusive it is. And yet, you know, it really seems like most liberals seem to find themselves stuck in either, you know, what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance, which we'll talk about in just a moment, or else they've sort of devolved into this exclusionary kind of condescending us versus them mentality that, you know, they're using the same slogans and sound bites of tolerance, but they're enacted in a way that's every bit as ethnocentric and discriminatory as the most conservative groups that they're criticizing. And again, for those who aren't familiar, you know, I wanted to read this really brief quote. Here's what Karl Popper had to say about tolerance versus intolerance. He says, "Less well known is the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance." Let me read that again. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we're not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right to not tolerate the intolerant. And again, that was Karl Popper. So in other words, Ken, as you like to say, you know, to transcend and include is simultaneously to negate and preserve. In other words, you know, we don't want sort of a reckless inclusion. We don't include our cancer cells. We negate the tumors for the health of the total organism. Tolerance is obviously critical. It's massively important, but not to the point of tolerating intolerance. Now, you know, it seems to me that this word tolerance, when it gets enacted at the green level, it often skews too far in the direction of inclusivity, right? So everything gets included, everything gets flattened, and there's no real way to sort of discern what's more or less worthy of that inclusion. But when the same value of tolerance gets enacted at the amber regressive level, it immediately becomes just riddled with contradiction. There's no longer an effort to include the rich diversity of views and values and perspectives that are available to us. Instead, we only include the people who explicitly share these same values about inclusion. We include everyone except those assholes who don't think we should include anyone. Fuck those guys. And this really isn't. This has nothing to do with the paradox of intolerance. This is a paragon of intolerance. So I'm wondering, Ken, what do you think about this? What are some sort of appropriate constraints on tolerance and inclusivity? And how do you think liberals and progressives can do a better job including and even enfolding with their political opposition or simply with people who don't share their same political views?
Yeah, well, it's interesting if you look at historically the rise of these political issues. And as we pointed out a bit earlier, the liberal political philosophy itself was a relatively recent emergence. And it really came into existence when world-centric stages of development had become about that 10% leading edge of the population. And this really only started around 1700s, 1800s in the modern West. There were always individuals in the past who were advanced or highly evolved, however we want to view that, that had access to a lot of these higher stages of development. But as culture itself, on the whole, sort of moved along, that was a little bit slower process. And we didn't really see the emergence of about 10% of the population at Orange, which also meant a movement in moral development from the previous Amber, which is strictly ethnocentric, to Orange, rational, world-centric modes of awareness. And this was quite new. So because it focused on rationality for the first time, instead of the previous cognitive stage, which is what Gebser referred to as mythic, they started to, for the first time, talk about something that was referred to as universal rights. And this is quite different. Previously, you tended to have individuals, theorists, writers, leading edge thinkers, who would talk about your rights as, let's say, a Christian, and the rights you lose if you surrender your belief in Christianity, or as your rights that you had as a Frenchman versus Englishman, or something like that. But with the Western Enlightenment, we start to see all of these treatises on the universal rights of human beings. And that wasn't the right that you had because you were Christian or because you were French or because you were this or you were that, but simply by virtue of the fact that you were born a human being. And that was a radically new idea. Mm-hmm. It's also the reason that it was only during that period, as those values began to kind of permeate culture, that humanity finally figured out that slavery is a rotten way to treat a human being. So even during the great axial period, when all the world's great religions were laid down, the core of them was often a mythic, literal stage of spiritual development. They also tended to have small schools that were involved with waking up practices. And those are really crucially important. And they included the great authentic mystics, Zen Buddhists, Advaita Vedanta, and so on. But still, the cultural center of gravity itself tended to be at this mythic, literal level. And so the religions themselves were separate. And again, at that time, there really wasn't much choice. There were a few people that, there was little awareness that there was anything like global village, for example. It just wasn't an idea that anybody realized at that point. And so as these universal rights first appeared, it almost sort of, not that it was a good thing, but it was sort of human nature, that they were first applied to the people that had power. And in the modern West, that basically meant able-bodied, white, cisgendered, heterosexual males. And they were all considered equal. That everybody else, not so much. But the principle itself was so unlimited. It never, ever said, okay, just this group or just that group has equal rights. The claim was everybody has equal rights. And so that, in the coming years, that was just increasingly applied to more and more and more human beings, which really was an enormous emancipation around the world, certainly in countries that were adopting this. And so it was applied to, in America, for example, it was applied to Black men. Then it was applied to women. There's a continual push from liberals and even far left to apply it, just to more and more and more. Anywhere you can find a minority that had previously not achieved widespread acceptance, then this becomes a source of activism. So one of the latest is transgender rights, for example. It's a very, very small percentage of the population, but certainly as deserving of equal rights as anybody. When the liberal philosophy itself was first introduced, and we had people from John Stuart Mill to John Locke, the notion of tolerance was a central idea. Because one thing that was certain is that the previous stage, amber ethnocentric stages of development, Claire Graves, by the way, the upper three major stages of first tier, amber, orange, and green. Claire Graves referred to those as absolutistic, which was amber. And so it held a belief, and it just thought that was absolutely unalterably true. So if you were a Christian at an amber ethnocentric stage, you believed every word that was written in the Bible. It was the absolute word of God. Moses really did part the Red Sea. Lot's wife really was turned into a pillar of salt. That's all absolutely true. And that's the absolutistic stage. But as this third person perspective continued to be added, and you could do hypothetical deductive reasoning and actually carry that out, then you start to get the rise of a modern scientific approach instead of a more second person, mythic, literal, ethnocentric approach. So if you're at an amber ethnocentric stage, tolerance is not your concern. Your concern is a cohesion within like-minded believers. And anybody who's not a believer, not only do you have no tolerance for them, you actually consider them in many cases to be demonic. They're certainly, it's okay to attack them, even kill them, murder them. Some 300,000 witches were burned during the Middle Ages. Most of them women, by the way. But when this whole orange world-centric moral stance, technically also called post-conventional, when that started to emerge, the writers on that, one of the primary virtues that they listed was tolerance. And that orange understanding of tolerance, none of them had any trouble with saying just straightforwardly that by tolerance, we mean we tolerate everybody except those who are intolerant. We don't tolerate that. It defeats the whole purpose. So that wasn't much of a Popperian paradox at that point. It's fairly straightforward. And none of them really considered it to be any sort of logical contradiction or anything like that. You first start to get the green stage emerging in any sort of significant degree during the 60s. So as I pointed out a couple times, in 1959, around 3% of the American population was at green, pluralistic. Graves actually referred to green as relativistic. Mm-hmm. And that's important because amber was absolutistic, and then Graves called orange multiplistic. And that was simply because, again, it introduced a third-person perspective, so it could start to take universal third-person viewpoints and begin to realize that there were a lot of other types of perspectives that were available. Orange still tended to think that science is the best way to find truth, but they recognized there were lots of other kinds of perspectives there, and you really had to look at those carefully. Mm-hmm. And not all of those were open to scientific verification. So you had to be really aware of that kind of situation. But by the time you get to green, relativism, that bond to any sort of objective truth or confirmable value system, that was broken. Mm. Because it really was adding a kind of fourth person perspective. And that could look at all these orange, like universal sciences, for example. Orange didn't have Hindu chemistry versus Christian chemistry. It just had chemistry.
Right.
And so green would look at that and go, well, yeah, but wait a minute. And so green did tend to be highly reflexive of orange systems. And green also has a kind of inherently critical attitude because it's reflecting on all those things and it's just going, well, wait a minute, that doesn't really include all these multiple cultural differences. And so green would eventually be associated with terms like multiculturalism and inclusivity and diversity. One of the issues, of course, is that a real inclusivity gets greater and greater with each major stage of development. Mm-hmm. So even amber was more inclusive than the previous egocentric stages. And then multiplistic was more inclusive than amber absolutistic. And then green, at least in terms of how it could conceptually think of things, took even more perspectives than orange. The problem was that whereas green tended to differentiate orange systems, and instead of just this monolithic single universal system, everything was multicultural truths and everything was different from culture to culture. And you really couldn't make any statement that applied to all human beings. Those are now out. They're not allowed. Mm-hmm. And you would even have somebody like the entire California educational system, Berkeley, UCLA, all of them, would come out and say, quote, the claim that there's only one race, the human race, is a racist statement. So they're getting hyper sensitive to these kinds of things. And in ways where that possibility of paradox of tolerance becomes really a kind of foremost issue, and one that green never really learned to handle well. Mm-hmm. And one of the major reasons, again, is that although it could differentiate all these systems, it didn't really have enough cognitive capacity to actually integrate them in a believable, accurate, and fair fashion. That would happen only with that monumental leap to second tier and the unfolding of stages that most developmentalists actually refer to with terms like integrative or integral, systemic, those types of things. So part of the difficulty, well, by the way, also when that green value system was added, what we really had in culture at large now, even though most developmental models have around 6 to 8 major stages of development. So there are several stages leading up to amber, Many models have 2 stages or so of amber. Some have 2 substages of orange, that kind of thing. But we're talking just very generally, in very sort of overview way. And the emergence of amber became sort of the leading cultural edge, particularly in even a lot of modern Western countries where that leading edge had been at orange. But as orange continued to grow and expand, those became the 2 major value systems in most Western cultures. And of course, a lot of others that you can come up with if you look at people's quadrant preferences or different personality types, big 5 factor and all that. All of those will give you sort of different types of values, and they're all important. These major stages of development are really probably the single largest contributor to value ideas. And when there are only 2, amber and orange, basically, although again, there are 6 or so smaller divisions of that. But with these 2 major value systems, they basically got along relatively okay, although they did recognize that they had some major differences. And that's essentially where the 2-party system arose. And that's where the 2 political values that we call left and right originate, from those major 2 structures. So if we go back and during the emergence of the orange liberal, and it was correctly called liberal, that was the new philosophy that came into existence to represent that orange universal world-centric stage of development. And it just so happened that in the French Assembly, the old-time believers who wanted to conserve the present ethnocentric culture, they happened to sit in the right-hand side of the French Assembly, and these new upstart, newfangled orange liberal folks sat in the left-hand seats. So they were often just referred to as left and right. And we continue to keep those definitions. But then one of the things that happened starting in the 60s is we got the emergence of that 3rd major value structure. And that basically threw everything into turmoil. Because now we don't just have, 2 sort of fairly obviously different choices. We have a 3rd. And given that they're all first tier, all of them really basically despise each other.
Yeah.
And so what we started to get in the 60s was the beginning of what we would come to call the culture wars. And green itself, as a relativistic structure, one of its sort of main original impetuses was again to be critical of orange and how it sort of had this monolithic universality. And green would start to criticize that and say, well, wait a minute, there really are multicultural truths and we have to take those into account. And the problem was it really was relativistic. So again, it really couldn't prioritize any culture or any truths for that matter. And the leading postmodern, and this is called postmodern because orange had initiated the era of modernity as opposed to the previous amber ethnocentric, which are known as traditional values. Well, as orange introduced modernity, when green came in, it really began defining itself as postmodern. And it would also, and this is sort of an important distinction, if we just look at the left and the right, and it's important right now to separate that from what we call Republican and Democrat Republican, because how those represented left and right is actually kind of shifted a bit over the years. What we call Democrats, for example, that we normally think of as left and liberal, they ended up being the party that was in favor of slavery during the Civil War. All of the Jim Crow laws passed after the Civil War were passed by Democratic assemblies, had Democratic governors. The KKK was started as the military arm of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's really not a pleasant history. It's almost always covered up. But as we tended to move forward, there tended to be a bit of a shift between how those are represented. And Republicans tended, at least hardcore Republicans tended to start representing more of that ethnocentric, absolutistic, traditional state values.
Yeah, which can, just briefly, which is why today the party of Lincoln are the ones that are often defending the Confederate flag, for example, and all the the statues and things like that. So
that's right. Yeah. And what happened in the 60s, though, was that the Democrats, so let me go back now to just technically left and right. The left, which was indeed the original liberal, that was faced, they're also often called progressives, because being rational and science-oriented, they accepted evolutionary theory and progression forward, whereas the right, the true conservatives, they didn't buy it. They much more still adopted a belief in the mythic religion. They held that that was what was really extremely important. They're highly patriotic, nationalistic, and so on. Whereas there's always a progressive tendency, because liberals recognized universal equality of all people, that there is also a tendency to be sort of less focused on patriotism and your own identity, and think more about a global humanity. That was sort of where your sentiments like. Well, when Green emerged in the 60s, and by 1972, Jacques Derrida was the most frequently quoted academic writer in America, and over 10% of the population was at Green. So Green had reached a tipping point. And the Green itself referred to itself as postmodern, also often referred to itself as post-liberal, because they really, Green didn't like Orange. Well, no first-tier stage likes each other. So what we had with those three value systems is, we have a saying, two's company, three's crowd. Well, all of a sudden, we went from two, amber and orange, to three, amber, orange, and green. And that was the beginning of the culture wars. That was a real problem. And the difficulty is that the Democrats, in this case, meaning leftists, they tended, and I don't know how many of them exactly, I'll just say half, 50%, half of them bumped up to green because they were progressives and they were moving forward. And the old-time liberals, old-time leftists, stayed at orange. But then the traditional conservatives that were anchored at amber ethnocentric, they also bumped up a stage into orange liberal values. And so, sort of strangely, it's sort of odd bedfellows that this new kind of right orientation was now advancing liberal values. These people became the ones that would vocally support something like free speech. Whereas the new left, the Green Democrats, they don't like free speech that much. They're fine with controlling it even. 40% of millennials say they have no problem with the government controlling speech. So we really have this tension now in both parties. In the liberal Democratic Party, we have the old liberals that have really been pushed to the background. And then we have the new left, which is green and multicultural, and its most commonly mentioned values are inclusivity and diversity. And they're not really, they really have pushed their sort of older Democrats aside. Although you see them go back and forth, and particularly when it comes to presidential politics.
Mm.
Al Gore went back and forth daily. He'd come out one day and he'd go there, and then he'd come out the next day and say just the opposite and go orange, and then he'd go green. Hillary had a hard time. She finally settled on green. A bit of a mistake.
But yeah, there was that divide between Bernie and Hillary where I think this fault line really, I mean, it became obvious. And we still have it today with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus the rest of the Democratic sort of neoliberal establishment.
That's right. And part of the problem with green is that it really is becoming sort of so inclusive, but without any real understanding of how to bring diverse elements together.
Right.
And one of the major problems, as just a simple example, is this green value itself. And I'll also contrast it by saying that if you go back to original orange liberal, because it was a move from ethnocentric, or just some groups have rights and values and so on, to world-centric, where there's an explicit drive to treat all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. That's original liberal. And that's particularly the demand that there's absolutely equal opportunity for every race, color, sex, or creed in the society. And it really does mean, I sometimes use the example, it's like if you're running a 100-meter dash in the Olympics, equal opportunity means everybody who's qualified to run that race gets to run that race. Nobody's excluded because of their race or sex or gender or creed or religious belief, none of that. Anybody who's qualified to run the race gets to run the race. That's equal opportunity. And that was what orange liberal approaches brought. That's what tended to be instituted in representative democracies. And it was a major, major step forward. Well, among other things, it was almost solely responsible for humanity actually getting rid of slavery. So even back into the rise of the great religions, every single one of them had slavery. None of them objected. Buddhist monasteries had slaves. Christian monasteries had slaves. My favorite one was St. Paul's admonition to slaves to, quote, obey your master and love Jesus Christ. It's like, really? That's your best Christian advice? But all of a sudden, by the time you get to the rise of modernity with orange, rational, Western Enlightenment, in about a 100-year period from 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed in every single rational industrial country on the face of the planet. Nothing like that ever happened. And so that equal opportunity was an absolutely central foundation of the rise of modern representative democracies, and a great movement for equality across the board. Now, what happens when we get to green is that there's still that drive to be inclusive, but it's getting, again, more and more intense. And the problem is it's run right up to the top of first tier. So really, again, it can differentiate all of those, but it can't yet integrate them and make the leap to second tier. And so it just gets very, very, very intense in demanding equality. And here, in particular, the demand isn't just for equal opportunity, because you can still have everybody have equal opportunity, but if some people have any sort of intrinsic advantage for whatever reason, it could be biological, it could just be their interest. Maybe some groups just aren't interested in doing mathematics or in learning how to play a grand piano or something like that. And so they end up being disproportionately represented in those professions. All of that disturbed green. And what green wanted is what's often called equal outcome. So in the 100-meter Olympic dash, green doesn't just want everybody to start at the same time. They want everybody to finish the race at the same time. Everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a profession, and we'll be talking about sex and gender later, but if you have a profession where, say, 70% of the profession is male and 30% female, then that categorically means oppression for green. And it really won't accept any other explanation. And that becomes a staggeringly huge problem. And that is indeed a type of performative contradiction that does get involved in Popper's paradox. Because in essence, what you're saying is that all value systems are absolutely the same. There's no difference in value systems, except my value system that says that, that's the one correct one.
Right.
All the others are actually wrong. You said, wait a minute, you just said that none of them are better than the others. Well, forget that. So that just wasn't addressed, and that became a real issue. Because even as green started to demand equality and say it really valued inclusivity, it was really focused on identity politics and really tracking which groups are achieving equality and which ones aren't. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, identity politics becomes a fundamental way that you organize how you're looking at a culture. And since just historically, human beings being human beings, there was a long, long progression from where we started about 500,000 years ago, which was the only number of people that you really accepted were the number of people that were in your tribe.
Right.
And you were all related by kinship ties. You knew exactly where you were related because you fit with each other because you're all related to each other. And kinship ties determined the organization of the tribe. Originally, and we're not talking about any indigenous people alive today that continued to undergo evolution, but the original tribes, 500,000 years ago. And also they were relatively rare at the start, so they would only occasionally bump into each other. And when they did, they had no idea how to actually relate with the other tribe because the kinship ties don't have any meaning. And so almost always other tribes were viewed as demonic or evil or threatening. And very frequently there was war, all out warfare. And what that means, I mean, every member of the tribe fought. Men, women, it was just a free-for-all between tribes. There were only about 30 or 40 people in size anyway. But we went from that degree of organization to, at some point, tribes started actually coming together into large sort of super tribe organizations. And often that would happen with the emergence of mythic modes of thinking out of archaic and magic. Because what happens with a mythic idea, like the belief in Yahweh, is that now all of a sudden, if you're from a different tribe and have a completely different kinship lineage, so that you and I can't be brothers in any biological sense, but if we both believe in Yahweh, then we're both brothers of that true father. And so Yahweh, for example, could unite the 12 tribes of Israel into an actual coherent unit. And so that started increasing. And then those coherent tribes often came together with other tribes, and we ended up with empires. And empires eventually gave rise to sort of coherent nation states, and those would often then certainly expand in terms of trade interactions. And now we're on the verge of again, that sort of global village. And so what you see there is an unmistakable manifestation of the essential drive of the universe itself. I mean, going all the way back to the Big Bang, it's not the case that there are just four forces in the physical world, which are often called strong, weak, nuclear, electromagnetic, and gravitational. Even many evolutionary biologists today like Stuart Kaufman, have introduced the notion there's actually a fifth force in the universe, and they call it self-organization. Because there's no other real way to account for Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, which would tend to emphasize just selfishness. There's some other sort of drive happening there that actually draws people together into larger and larger and larger units. That's the same drive that, starting at the Big Bang, took small individual quarks, brought them together into electrons, protons, and neutrons, then took those, brought them together into atoms, took atoms, brought them together into molecules, took molecules, brought them together into living cells, took cells, brought them together into organisms, and on up the tree of life. I mean, that's an inherent drive in the universe. And the second law of thermodynamics can really be misunderstood, because all it really says is if you take a hunk of the physical universe, not even really the living universe or conceptual universe, just the physical material universe, cut it off from the rest of the universe, put it in a box, and then watch it, it runs down. Mm-hmm. So fine. So that's supposedly everything. That's the drive that everything is following. But it's not. If you let that out of the box and put it with the rest of the universe and then watch it over time, there's Ilya Prigogine actually got the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that even matter itself, just insentient, dead matter, when it becomes pushed far from equilibrium, it jumps into a higher order of structure. And it actually becomes more order. It's often called order out of chaos. Mm-hmm. That's a drive towards higher unity. And that's what we see in the universe, again, all the way back to Big Bang. And that's what's actually happening. So it happened all the way through evolution on Earth. And when human beings showed up, we contained all of those previous holons in our own being. Quarks, atoms, molecules, cells, reptilian brainstem, mammalian limbic system. And then we started undergoing our own stages of development. And Gebser's simple version, of course, archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic, relativistic to integrated or integral. And that's part of the inherent drive that we see. The difficulty with grain, particularly as a leading edge, is it's still under that drive. It's still being pushed by that drive. There are other drives as well. I mean, we say all holons have all four drives. Right. So they have agency and communion horizontally, which doesn't change levels. It just works within. And then you have vertical drives. You drive to higher unity, we call it eros. There's also a lower embracing drive. And if that goes pathological, you actually get thanatos, actually drive. Actually, second law of thermodynamics is thanatos operating. So they were under that eros pressure, and they did arrive at consciously saying, we want inclusivity, we want diversity, and so on. But because of their emphasis on identity politics, part of the problem is that they look back at this long history of human unfolding that went through really very egocentric stages and into several stages of ethnocentric. And again, only very recently, just a few hundred years ago, moved into world-centric stages. And so most grand postmodern multiculturalists, first of all, multiculturalism doesn't mean studying other cultures. It doesn't, most multiculturalists don't know a thing about other cultures. All they know is that Western culture is demonic. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to the planet, and they're going to fix it. And they're going to fix it because unmistakably, all history up through the emergence of modernity and the Enlightenment, and then for another 100 years or so, as the principles of equality and freedom from the Enlightenment began, as I say, being applied to more and more areas, and finally arrives at an orange and then green, truly inclusive kind of structure. But everybody's still born at square one. And everybody, even in an orange or green culture, has to go through those egocentric into ethnocentric, into world-centric stages. And not everybody makes it.
Right.
And so we do have people that are ethnocentric stages of development, and that's a problem. Now, the problem with the postmodern multicultural solution is to simply say, everybody must agree that we're all the same. And they don't realize that their own value system itself is the product of around 6 major stages of nested hierarchical development.
That's right.
But because they want equality, they deny all hierarchies entirely. And they don't understand the difference between dominator hierarchies, which are all the horrible things that they say they are, and growth hierarchies, which are these stages that transcend and include and actually go from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric and integrated stages. So the very values that they're representing are the product of 6 hierarchical stages of development. And when they deny that hierarchy, they're shooting themselves in the foot or the head, but it's suicidal. They're categorically killing the path to their own values. And that becomes problematic, and also becomes sort of the foundation of their deeply self-contradictory orientation. So they're maintaining that all values, all groups are the same, but because they think that there's all these bad and problematic, oppressed people out there, misdiagnosing the cause of that, they simply pick the one group that they think are the great oppressors. And these, at least in the Western world, do involve, and we'll talk about this later, but it's not white privilege, it's majority privilege, which is exactly the same privilege every other culture around the world instills. And what happens as you start to move out of majority privilege is you'll start to extend again those rights, certainly of equal opportunity, for as many minorities and excluded, marginalized individuals as you can find. But the multicultural, postmodern, green, far left orientation, it really focuses on things like white privilege and so-called toxic masculinity. And those are the causes of everybody else's problems. And so, first of all values are not the same, because one group's values are mean, vicious, oppressive, tyrannizing, and toxic. That's a complete misunderstanding of the core dynamics of human evolution, and is simply sort of representative of stages that are moving towards even more inclusive, and is certainly more inclusive than previous stages. I mean, have managed to get rid of, well, even in the United States today, it's categorically against the law to discriminate in any way against any minority. I mean, women say there's a wage gap. It's against the law to pay men more than women for the same job. If you do that, you go to jail. It's not allowed. And of course, it used to be back in the 40s and 50s that there was something of a wage gap, because women hadn't themselves decided that they really wanted to move into the productive sphere more. When that started to happen in the 60s and women started to do that, then the wage gap started closing fast. And in many cases, it's because we put sort of social pressures and in some cases even laws into play. That imbalance tended to shift. And in some cases, it's gone now in the other direction. So we will go over this later as well on sex and gender. But in you see it in education as well. You see it in employment and pay. In 1970, 61% of college degrees were gotten by men and only 39% by women. Today, it's exactly reversed. 61% of college degrees in virtually every area are had by women, and men only get about 39%. Men are actually bailing out of higher education by the droves, in large measure because their toxic masculinity is how they're defined. It's not a really welcome atmosphere, particularly for young men in their 20s. And so that's a real issue. The wage gap, 3 years ago, Time magazine, working with a lot of sophisticated polling organizations, looked at 150 of the largest cities in the country and looked at specific job comparisons, the actual work, compared the actual work among men and women. And they did find a wage gap. Women got paid about 108% more than men across the board. In some cities, it was more like 20% advantage that women were getting paid. So that's also kind of flipped. So we have to be really, really careful about how we use theories, in some cases like feminism, that arose in the 60s when there were still a lot more of those kinds of imbalances. But culture still has this drive of errors, this drive to be more and more genuinely unifying and inclusive. And so we set in motion items that would address that. And in many cases, those have been addressed. So it becomes a problem if we're still echoing statements that may have been true 50 years ago, but are just categorically not that true now. So we really have to be careful about that. And you don't hear, by the way, feminists worrying about men only getting 39% of college degrees. There's no complaint about that. And so as long as women just continue to get more than men, they're happy. So we really have to adjust how we're looking at these things. What happens when you, in terms of tolerance, when you get to second tier, is, among other things, second tier is looking at items in a much broader perspective. So they're including areas, aspects, and dimensions that tend to be missed by first tier. And one of the things the second tier takes into account are interior stages of development. So one of the first things that second tier will do when it looks at marginalization and oppressive forces is it won't say just what are the lower right social structural factors that might be contributing to that, but they'll look at the left-hand quadrants and say, okay, what stage of development are we at? Because those marginalizing, oppressive, tyrannical forces are almost exclusively at ethnocentric and lower stages. They're at absolutistic stages. When you think that your view is absolutistically right and others are wrong, and particularly if you have a group of like-minded ethnocentric people, then you feel absolutely justified in oppressing or marginalizing that other group because they're wrong, they're problems, they're even demonic if you happen to be religiously oriented. And by the way, almost everybody coming from an ethnocentric, absolutistic stage of development has some sort of fundamentalist belief. So you can be fundamentalist Marxist or fundamentalist white supremacist or fundamentalist feminist, and you actually have a religion, and it's acted upon as a fundamentalist religion. Mm. And that's why you can hear some social commentators, studies have shown that people have an intuitive understanding of increasing stages of development. And so if you take like a standard model of development that has, let's say, 6 or 7 major stages of development that they recognize, and you write a paragraph coming from each of those stages. So there's a paragraph from red, a paragraph written in amber, a paragraph written in orange language, a paragraph written in green, a paragraph in teal. Mix them up, show them to people, and just tell people, arrange these in order of increasing sophistication. They'll get around 90% of them right. Even if they've never studied developmental psychology, don't know anything about it. So there is this kind of intuitive understanding that's happening. So one of the things that you see increasingly happening with social commentators who are really trying to figure out, there's this enormous confusion about why today's far left isn't liberal. And so many of the people, like, let's say, Dave Rubin, that have been on the left as a real liberal all their lives and have now walked away from it, is they say that the left today isn't liberal, that they're illiberal, they're anti-liberal, and I don't get it. They've gone just completely insane. And it's becoming a real problem. Mm. And so they don't really know how to act with that. Many of them, of course, I think even like Dave Rubin, aren't quite comfortable calling themselves Republicans. Right. Because as Republican has unfolded, part of its base has included people that are coming up through amber for the first time. Mm. And so they're ethnocentric in a sense, crazy as it might sound, but they're in a natural unfolding. And it can be, of course, extremely vicious. And the classic sort of fascist orientation is an orientation that has an amber value system and will put it into play, where the classic communist stance is a green egalitarianism. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we're seeing far extreme left green get more and more extremist and more zealot and more absolutistic. And so that's the main problem that I have with the far left today. Yep. That it's got this regressive trend. And as I was saying, there are a lot of social commentators that, starting with Masjid Nawaz, this terrific liberal Muslim reformist, he started referring to that far left as the regressive left, because he was intuiting that they're coming from amber. Right. And this is shocking, because you never, ever, certainly even in my life when I was growing up, child of the 60s, you never expected that kind of active, almost oppressive intolerance coming from the left. Right. You always expected that from the right. To see it coming from the left was shocking. And that's what's happened to so many of the people, from Jordan Peterson to Dave Rubin, really focusing their criticism on the left. Mm-hmm. Even though the classic fascist, real white supremacists, are the pure ethnocentric amber. No doubt about it. We'll talk a little bit, I think, when we get to violence, maybe, mm-hmm. On how that, if you just say sort of flat out, which is worse in terms of likelihood of oppression or violence or murderous aggression. Just straightforwardly, healthy green versus natural amber, no question. amber, no question, supremacist, fascist, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
The problem historically is that we got a lot of green, egalitarian philosophical ideas come along, were applied politically, and got a regression to amber. And historically, that, which turns out to be communist organizations, have killed about 10 times more people than fascists.
Right.
It's horrifying.
Yep.
But what happens with an integral tolerance is we say, okay, we not only need behavior that's tolerant and truly inclusive, but we need ways to help get people up to values that they themselves will be inclusive. You can't just say, you be this way.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
Right.
And that's one of the alarming things that has, unfortunately, we have learned as a categorically ironclad rule in developmental psychology, is that you have to go through these stages. You can't skip them, you can't delete them, but they're there. And you can't talk somebody out of the stage they're at.
That's right.
You can't use evidence or logic or a nice fine reasoning. It won't work.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody once said you can't reason somebody out of anything that they weren't reasoned into. And stage of development, you don't reason into it. You're not, 5 years old at magic and go, I need to develop a mythic now and talk yourself into doing it. Nor if you're at, a magic mythic stage and somebody comes along and gives you all the arguments in the world that you should be rational, logic, even if you understand the arguments, you shake your head, won't have any impact at all. It's not going to change your stage of development at all.
Right.
And unfortunately, virtually none of the first tier stages give that much attention to interiors. Strangely, some are a little bit better than others. And paradoxically, ironically, weirdly, the only stage of development of all of them that denies stages of development is green. And it's our leading edge of cultural evolution right now. So thanks a lot for that, green. And that's my problem. Otherwise, green is healthy. It's extraordinary. It's an increase in perspectives. It's an incredible attempt to really be inclusive. But because it doesn't have enough integrative components available, it crashes, this relativism crashes into a fragmented retribalization tendency if it goes extreme. And it goes extreme as soon as it starts failing at what it's trying to do. And it'll tend to fail at what it's trying to do because it's not yet at second tier.
Right.
So that's the main problem. And what that's one of the reasons that we've seen more polarization than literally at any time in history. And there have actually been specific, almost empirically scientific studies on the amount of polarization in the United States from the very beginning all the way up to today. And, it goes like this and it goes like this. And today it's like that. It's horrifying.
Right.
And it really is a retribalization. It's group identity politics regressed back to an amber absolutistic stance. And that's really becoming pretty nightmarish, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, well said, Ken. It feels to me like there's almost a new paradox of tolerance that the green altitude in particular is struggling with, which is, look, there's a lot in today's world. There is a lot of intolerance being emboldened today in a way that we haven't seen in decades.
Yeah.
And a lot of liberals, a lot of progressives, particularly at the green altitude, are feeling, justifiably so, they're feeling outrage at this sort of resurgence of intolerance. But for example, this past week, Representative Steve King said something along the line, I'm paraphrasing here, said something along the lines of, why is it that phrases like white nationalism and white supremacism are suddenly bad words? And it's like, dude, these have always been bad words. At least in terms of modern history, these have always been bad words. So So the left has plenty of genuine intolerance that they're trying to push off of. The paradox they're falling into is that it's making them become genuinely intolerant themselves.
That's right.
They don't have a sense of developmental diversity.
Right.
Yeah.
And that gives us the regressive left.
That's right.
And so I think it is important that we distinguish between liberal, which technically means that orange, rational, equal opportunity type of equality, and realize that green, far left today isn't liberal, almost by their own accounts. And that's what, again, one of the most amounts of confusion that I notice as I listen to all these people talking about it. Because, I mean, everybody from Ben Richards to Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson will say, I'm not talking, when I say left, I don't mean liberal. I mean just progressive or left, or they'll come up with other terms. So I think it's important to make that distinction. Yeah. So I tend to call a green left political orientation either green left or progressive. It seems to be fine, but not liberal. Because that really is, liberal is turning out to be one of three value systems. And it's odd because the whole point about the way healthy development is supposed to go is transcend and include. So when green emerged, it can transcend equal opportunity and bring in a little bit of equal outcome. And I'll give a brief explanation of that in a minute. But it didn't do that. It got so upset with not having equal outcome that it wants to just take away equal opportunity. It wants to take away liberal orientations. And so it will restrict speech if it hurts somebody's feelings. They don't mind at all doing that. The focus is no longer on anything like an individual liberty. It's group liberty and group identity, and that's it. And that's nightmarish. Now, the way they got that and the way equal outcome has a little bit of important part to play. And I know a lot of liberals, and including the people like Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin and so on, categorically will say that equal outcome per se is just bad. And all you want is equal opportunity. But here's where equal outcome has a role to play. And that is, we've already acknowledged that not only historically, but in today's world, everybody's born at square one. And so the simplified stages that we're using, they'll go from egocentric stages into ethnocentric stages, and then into world-centric stages. And it's only as they move into world-centric stages. And by the way, by some estimates, it varies depending on which model of developmental psychology you're using. And those vary because each of them generally focus on a different multiple intelligence. So you have cognitive intelligence, moral intelligence, emotional intelligence, so on. But depending on which of those models you look at, some of them have only about 30% of the American population at truly world-centric stages of self-development. So Robert Kagan estimates, for example, that 3 out of 5 people don't make it to world-centric. So we've got some 60% of the population ready to be ethnocentric, including all the regressive left, by the way, because you still, as you're coming up, it's really easy to cognitively latch on to, an in vogue, chic, multicultural value system as your center of gravity is still ethnocentric on the way up. So you're not even really regressive left in that sense. You're down there actually with the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis. That's where they actually are, and so are you.
Right.
But the majority of the left that I am criticizing, regressive left, and that as an issue becomes a problem in the culture because it's an invitation for people on the way up to their own developmental unfolding, to latch on to and allow their self-sense to just stay at ethnocentric, because in a sense that's what they're doing. That retribalization makes sense down there, and that really is part of an overall problem with that. What you see as a postmodern, progressive, far left, green political thinkers tend to address tolerance is they'll just come up, unlike orange equal opportunity, they'll just come up with, well, Herbert Marcuse introduced a distinction between what he called liberating tolerance and repressive tolerance. And repressive tolerance is when you accept as many views as you can. And liberating tolerance is when you agree with his views. And so that's what you're supposed to tolerate. And that's just a classic way that ends up happening. Yeah. What I was going to say about equal outcome is that we do have people coming up, and there is this tendency to ethnocentric prejudice and bigotry, unfortunately. Humans have to grow out of that. And of all the minorities, dozens and dozens of what can be considered minorities, ethnic differences, and even people that, are now one of 300 genders, which we'll talk about.
Sure.
But the two that you can tell just immediately when you meet somebody is whether they're black or white, and whether they're man or woman. Mm-hmm. So those two differences become major ones that an ethnocentric orientation will latch on to.
Right.
And that's just, again, it's kind of a natural stage that we have to go through. But those in particular, it's like if you meet somebody that, let's say is a white person, but they might be speaking, something Polish, or they might be speaking Hungarian, or they might be speaking Brazilian, or something like that. You really can't tell what ethnic they're. All you know is that they're sort of talking different. But if they're talking English, even with an accent, you can still sort of relate to them. And there's no immediate obvious prejudice that you can bring into play, except, well, they're foreigners, if you want to do it that way. But somebody's black or white in this country, or male or female, you know it immediately. And it's a very, very easy way to really group all of those types together, all of them. I mean, if you're a man who's having trouble with women, all women, it's not hard to figure out who they are. Mm-hmm. And if you're a white guy has trouble with black folks, or vice versa, black person has trouble with white, you don't have any trouble spotting them.
Yep.
Clear. And so that has really, and because everybody's coming up to those stages, those two in particular, which are called racism and sexism, those have really been kept alive because those are real issues that are really there. And the problem is you have to really be careful if you're just condemning everybody for doing that, or whether you're acknowledging there are world-centric and integral stages of development that don't do that. Not only are integral stages not doing it, they're actually thinking of ways that can overcome that. There are ways that actually work. But otherwise, you're going to tend to exaggerate the amount of ethnocentric oppression that there is in this country. So, just a quick example, and I did not mean to pick on this particular group or organization. I could pick on any of them, and I'm sure we will at some point. Black Lives Matter started because of violence, police violence on unarmed Black people. Now, that's a tragedy by any perspective. But in 2015, the number of unarmed Black men killed by policemen were 16. 16. So there's some 13% of the population in this country are black, so that's over 30 million. So if you want to make your major social concern that 16 out of 30 million people were hurt, by the way, more people die each year of bee stings, go ahead, make that your main social focus. But don't let that overlook other areas that are affecting a large number of your race or your ethnicity or your gender or sex or whatever it is. And it's that hyper exaggeration. Now, I have no doubt at all that simply being black and being in an urban area, that the cops are going to, many of them are going to at least look at you differently, are going to give you uncomfortable feelings. I got it. It's the same thing that women will come up with when they look at their interaction with men. And men are always sort of more pushy and more in their face and are hitting on them, and they don't do that to men. So they're very disposed to say those things make me uncomfortable. That doesn't mean, therefore, that person's intentionally trying to oppress me and hold me out of jobs and is paying me less for the same work I do. So we have to be very careful about that. But those kinds of feelings, which are real, that aren't against the law, aren't really holding somebody back or doing anything like that. If there's anything that does break the law, like I say, if you really do pay a man differently from a woman for the same job, you get fined or go to jail. That is against the law in this country. But to just take the atmosphere of uncomfortable differences and expand that up into a criminal activity, which the extreme green tends to do, that's part of what's driving this retribalization. That's what makes the automatic way I look at anybody else is how they're hurting me or oppressing me or tyrannizing me or something. And that leaves one group of people as the bad guys.
Right.
And that's white, cisgendered men.
Yep.
And that's that will backfire.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and just to prove that we are, in fact, equal opportunity offenders here, I think the same argument could be made on the other side of the aisle, where, for example, last year, the number of people killed by illegal immigrants was smaller than the number of people who were killed by lettuce. I don't see anyone declaring a national emergency around about our, lettuce in this country. So Ken, that was fantastic, and I love how you tracked sort of the emergence of this idea of tolerance from orange into green and into teal and turquoise, while reminding us that every step along the way we really do need this sort of it's tolerance with a boundary.
Right.
There's only so much that we are expected to tolerate before the entire sort of engine of development begins to break down. The barbarians raid the gates, and suddenly there's no more tolerance anywhere because nobody can make it to green anymore. So this brings us, I think, to the next question, the next topic, which is violence. In other words, what is an appropriate response when that boundary of tolerance is violated or transgressed in some way, both in terms of within a society and then sort of looking out, sort of, outside of our society? What is the role of America as world police, for example, is how a lot of people would frame it. And, I think that one of the coolest things I've read from you, Ken, where you discuss this, is actually from your essay, The Deconstruction of the World Trade Center, which we have right now on Integral Life and the deep dive section. If you guys haven't read it, go check it out. It is a beautiful, this was written, I think in 2002, probably about 6 months after the towers fell. Right. And it remains one of my favorite pieces of writing that you've done. And in this piece, you have a passage where you are talking about how the green altitude in particular relates to violence and nonviolence. And it's a little bit long, but I figured, Ken, what we'll do is we'll have you read it for us. And before you begin, basically this piece that you're about to read is a response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous statement, which is, quote, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral. begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And you've got a really cool response to that, if you want to share that.
Sure. But you see, that statement is wrong on almost every count. In this case, I believe his heart was clouding his head. Real violence is almost always ended by stronger violence in saner hands. When you meet a Hitler in this world, the correct, noble, ethical, spiritual response is get a gun and blow his brains out. We ended Auschwitz not with love, caring dialogue, sensitivity training, and sweet thoughts, but with a superior firepower, period. So it's with real violence in the real world. Much of it stems from red, and red can only be forcefully contained until it develops its own internal amber constraints. Civilization, for the most part, does not produce barbarism, but curbs it. Green's basic problem is that the injunction to not have violence in your heart is confused with not using violence in the real world. At which point Green begins to contribute to the problem, not the solution. This is yet another variation on the sad fact that Green, and without doubt the MGM, the Mean Green meme, and boomeritis, have been complicit in the rise of insurrectionist violence around the world. Of course, we should not harbor hate in our hearts. And of course, when you meet Nazis, you should kill them real hard. Of course, there are a few situations, a very few situations, in which nonviolence will work, namely in any culture that has Western Enlightenment values, such as America or Britain. And by Britain, I also mean any countries that at one point had British rule, like India. The only two cultures where nonviolence has actually worked as a strategy, so Gandhi and Martin Luther King. In any other culture possessed of pre-orange, pre-modern, pre-enlightenment values, if you lie down in the front of the approaching troops, why, thank you. Much easier to stomp your ass, and it saves us a ton of bullets. Try nonviolence with the Nazis, the KKK, the Sargons and Ramses and Pol Pots of this world, and see where it gets you. Dead, of course, is where it gets you. You see, with pre-orange waves, violence or the threat of violence is almost the only way you can end violence. At orange, physical war shifts to economic war, and the battlefield switches to the boardroom. Same war, different means. But only at green do people stop wanting to fight, and only at teal do they begin to use violence to strategically end violence. But the pre-orange waves only use violence, and that's the problem. Turning the other cheek is exactly what you don't want to do with pre-orange waves. Again, in your heart, no violence. In the world, do your duty. We want to include green, but also transcendent. So don't confuse having no violence in your heart with having no violence in the real world, if required. Your duty may or may not include violence, but let us not forget that there are indeed occasions where violence ends violence, or I should say, reflecting the messiness and microscopically incremental nature of eros. There are occasions where violence replaces a grosser violence with a subtler violence, a lesser devil on the way to a vaguely greater good. The Zen-inspired code of the samurai warrior is still as good a guide as any. The best fight is not to fight. The real sword is no sword. But if you think that means a samurai warrior never used his sword, you're a tad naive, I fear.
Fantastic. Thank you for reading that, Ken. I have always loved this passage. I think it's fascinating. It's one of the few examples I can think of where it actually depicts violence, or our capacity for violence, as being able to really spiral in either of two directions. There can be an upward spiral of violence that is actually aligned with Eros. And there's a downward spiral that leads straight to Thanatos. And I think, most people are very aware and very leery of the Thanatos drive, but I don't think a lot of people really appreciate how it's possible that violence can actually serve Eros, especially for people who, again, are at the green altitude. In some ways, Ken, I think this brings us back to, Popper's paradox of tolerance that we were just talking about. There are some things that just can't be tolerated by society. And sometimes the only effective response is a violent response. So, you don't negotiate with terrorists. You don't coexist with cancer. You don't use voice dialogue when someone is shooting up a theater. You kill the terrorist, you irradiate the cancer, and you shoot the shooter. And, just like the issues of tolerance and inclusion, I think that for a lot of people on the left, this relationship with violence gets expressed very differently at these different altitudes. So a green enactment of these values, particularly around nonviolence, it's typically one of radical nonviolence in all situations, which basically, again, all but ensures that civilization is going to get hijacked and destroyed by these pre-modern forces, these pre-modern altitudes. And this is, kind of the new age, can't we all just get along sort of wing of the left. But an amber enactment of these values really skews in, the opposite direction. It's to the point where, violence is not being exercised where and when it's appropriate. We have these, for example, these reports of Antifa attacking Trump supporters. This is not a stronger violence in saner hands. This is vigilante justice, and it's, it itself should not be tolerated by society. And, just as sort of a quick aside, as I mentioned Antifa, I think it's really important for us to be clear here. There's been a lot of studies recently, particularly over the last year or two. And basically, they're really pointing at this uptick that we're seeing recently of right-wing violence and domestic terrorism, especially in the last decade or so. And in fact, in recent years, they're actually showing that you're more likely to be killed by a right-wing terrorist than you are an Islamic terrorist, which is interesting. And I think if we were being honest, we would also include Islamic terrorism as another form of right-wing terrorism. Left-wing terrorism is largely trending downward after it really peaked in, especially the 1970s, but also throughout the 80s and the 90s. But, when it comes to which party is committing more violence, at least today, I don't think this is really both sides of the same situation. And I don't want anyone thinking that us criticizing the left's relationship with the violence is in any way sort of ignoring what's happening over there on the right. But I think it also doesn't mean that the left doesn't have a really, really deeply confused relationship with violence that in a lot of ways is actually feeding into this cycle of violence that we're seeing on the left and the right simultaneously. So I think that, when it comes to the question, Ken, the phrase a saner violence, it seems to me that, one of the big questions that we have is, okay, well, who gets to decide what's sane? Who gets to decide, whether violence or nonviolence is the appropriate response? And, this is where it gets really complicated, I think, because, we would probably say, well, preferably someone who's teal or turquoise at minimum. But in the real world, this all comes down to our, whoever happens to be the elected leader at any given time. And obviously they can be all the way up and down the spiral. So Trump sort of deciding, where violence is appropriate and where nonviolence is appropriate, he's probably going to have a slightly different algorithm than someone like an Obama or a JFK or, what have you. I guess I'm just wondering, what do you think about all of this, Ken? How is violence enacted and nonviolence enacted more responsibly and more effectively at the integral wave? Is there an appropriate use of violence and nonviolence in today's world? Is there any place at all for violence in terms of, political dissent within our nation? Or is this, sort of one of those very few situations that you mentioned where nonviolence really is sort of the best option?
Yeah, well, one of the things that becomes really crucial in terms of when violence is actually used is, almost every crime in the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence system demands an intent. And if you don't actually intend to do a crime, if you're completely uncontrollable for that, then we don't tend to take you as culpable. And we might do things like diagnose you psychiatrically and put you in a psychiatric hospital, but we're not going to give you the death penalty. We're not going to put you in jail for the rest of your life or something like that, because you're truly not responsible for your own drives. So violence itself, likewise, the degree of just its sheer criminality, so to speak, does depend in large measure on the type of intention that is behind its use. And one of the things that we find, and this does, again, it's not the case that just higher stages are all good and lower stages are all bad. We've seen, in fact, that, the higher you go, all it really means is when you make mistakes, they're more colossally huge mistakes.
Yeah.
So that, we're already up to green and seeing how confused it's getting.
Yeah.
But violence is, if you have like these, well, it used to be just extremely common. If the intent was an egocentric tribal intent, then warfare was very common. If it was an ethnocentric, we've got the one true way, we've got the one real God, then you get crusades and, empire attacks, and violence is just carried out on an almost daily measure. Mm-hmm. So humanity has seen 13 years of war for every year of peace in its history. But as you go up the scale, so to speak, in terms of intent, and then you do get into world-centric stages of intent, and then even integrated stages of intent. Violence there is definitely tied to the reason that you're undertaking it and your assessment of the nature and type of threat that you're dealing with. So even certainly if you're dealing with somebody who's just on an immediate, let's say, killing spree, who's pulled a machine gun and shooting people up, if it's a school shooter who's blowing people away, there was an extremely controversial situation down in the recent school shooting in Florida, where the cops who were assigned that actually stayed outside and took cover and didn't go inside and prevent some 17 murders or whatnot. That was a case where violence would have been justified. Mm-hmm. Simply because there really was no other way to stop that from happening. And what we don't want is to have just a blanket idea that violence of all sorts is bad and not something you should do. But the intent does become more and more thoughtful, more inclusive, more careful. It still wouldn't prevent some fairly large-scale violence if those are by deeply ethnocentric organizations intent upon doing as much harm to others as possible and highly armed themselves. That is something that just continues to call out for an appropriate response. And the other side of intention what you want to be careful about is justifying violence for essentially every wrong reason that you can think of.
That's right.
And yes, there are better and worse types of values, more inclusive and less inclusive, more tyrannical, less tyrannical, and so on. And just to make sure we can continue picking on green, broken green. It's gotten into a tendency. Well, I mean, even Antifa, this is classic regressive left. Antifa is named meaning anti-fascists. They are exactly similar to Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts. They all wear the same, black uniform, they cover their faces, crash into stuff. And more significantly, they're engaging in violence due to completely unjustifiable intent. And their intent is, we have the one correct way. We're so correct, we don't even have to talk to the other side. As a matter of fact, when the other side disagrees with us, that's a microaggression. They're actually attacking us. Their verbal statements are physical assaults on me, which gives me the right preemptively to physically attack them. And that's what's starting to happen. That is categorically regressive. That is classic amber violence.
Yep.
And the only time amber violence was acceptable is when we were first evolving to amber and trying to handle magic violence.
Yeah.
Red violence, which is vicious.
Yeah. Yeah, Ken, I was even wondering if Antifa qualified as amber violence. To me, it reminded me of those sections in Boomeritis when you're talking about during the 60s, civil rights protests and all that. You actually had this big undercurrent of red that were showing up just to basically wreak havoc. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of the energy behind things like Antifa is just like, I want to bash some fucking skulls.
Yeah, there was, it was a classic. One of the easy ways that they just sort of intellectually confuse it is through classic pre-post fallacy. So in one of the main Berkeley riots, for example, all of the rioting students claimed together that they were representing universal post-conventional moral stances. The war was immoral, and they were protesting that. But the actual tests of moral development were given, and about 30% of the protesters were post-conventional, and 70% were pre-conventional. They were there for egocentric reasons. They weren't against the war. They were, nobody tells me what to do, and I'm sure as hell not going to go over there. So don't tell me what to do, or I'll bash your face in. And that was the primary motivation, not to take away from the 30% that were genuinely morally concerned about it and had a right to be. But this is a problem. And it's certainly, whenever you see, it's one of the real problems of, where I say not everything about higher stages is necessarily better. When you get something wrong at a higher stage, you are a sophisticated, complex fuck up. It's not just a simple, oh, I've got the one and only God, you're a devil, I get to kill you. This is no, there are universal principles of right and wrong. We have to include everybody in a fair and equitable society, and there are groups that are oppressing other groups, and we are here to stop that. I mean, that's a very complex series of moral reasoning. If it's done correctly, it's right. That happens to be a good argument. If it's done incorrectly, it's, I'm a pre-conventional, all the way down to red, and that's what's driving me. And those really are brown shirts, black shirts. Those are fascists by definition. And of course, what do? Claim you're not a fascist. Claim you're against fascism. Claim you're anti-fascist. That's the slickest sleight of hand of all. Is simply be what you say you're trying to end. So you get to do it, but nobody else does. Well, that's great. What fascist doesn't want that?
Right.
So it really is kind of a problem. And we're starting to see that with just the whole movement, from trigger warnings to safe space, microaggressions, and all of that. And these are having profoundly deleterious effects on just the capacity of a human personality to be resilient and to be strong. You only get that way if not if you're staying in safe spaces, but if you're directly challenged. And that's what universities are supposed to do. They're not supposed to be a caring mommy and not opening to any sort of challenge or hurt at all. Yeah. So it's a real issue.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, Ken, in your passage, you know, I think that a naive reading of the passage you just read from Deconstruction of the World Trade Center, I think a naive reading of that could lead people to think that, oh, Ken is supporting Antifa because Ken just said, if you see a Nazi on the street, kill him dead. But, you know, I think that the issue here is this is where I think it's you know, the idea of interiors and exteriors gets really, really, really important here because obviously Nazism is one of those things that is not to be tolerated by our society. Absolutely not. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. However, the reason why it's not to be tolerant is because Nazis are monsters, right? But in order to be a monster, you have to do something monstrous. You have to do something behaviorally in the upper right quadrant that makes you monstrous. And at that point, if you're someone who does something monstrous, yeah, hopefully someone's going to shoot you in the head, right? But most of this resurgence that we're seeing is it's this superficial kind of trollish cosplayer Nazism where a lot of them are these like 4chan trolls who I think are just trying to get a rise out of their parents or, you know, what have you. It's a counterculture more so than a genuine kind of embodied belief in white, you know, ethno-supremacism or anything like that. And so I think that this is where we have to really start applying a scalpel here. Yes, if you see a legitimate Nazi out there, they are not to be tolerated. And there are probably plenty of cases where violence is an appropriate solution. However, hitting someone over the head with a bike lock just because they're wearing a Make America Great Again cap, this is not coming from anywhere close to green. This is, as you said, this is coming from red and amber. This is an expression of the intolerant against some imagining of another thing that should not be tolerated. And this is, I think, the cycle of violence that Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about.
Yeah, and that's why what wasn't stated explicitly in the sections that I read, but if you read the overall original piece, the whole idea is that there is this developmental unfolding, and that in the healthy sense, you want to continue that. And my point there is that if the intent is coming from these increasingly sophisticated and careful stages, then violence can be an appropriate action at that point. And that actually, I mean, if we say something like, somebody to hear that and think that therefore I'm, you know, for Antifa, you know, it's that if you see a Nazi, kill him. But even, or hit him over the head or something like that. We're also talking about the use of violence to actually make value distinctions. In other words, that there are genuine, authentic, ontological, nested growth hierarchies or holarchies that can be demonstrated. And so it was something like Antifa. Sure, if you see a Nazi, whack them on the head. The problem is the Nazis are Antifa. They're not, so whack them on the head. I mean, we have to be careful about that. I'm not necessarily recommending that. But the point is that, and we'll return to this when we talk about the point of power as well, because the piece that I just did, we'll be releasing it on the site, several hour presentation on what power is, what it means. And we're moving into violence. The next topic was power, right?
Yeah. Do you want me to segue into that now?
Why don't we just and let me just make a quick statement about it, and you can
Sure.
broader introduction, just so I can finish that point. But the presentation I had given was based on the fact that generally, like violence, we think that power is simply something bad, and that the use of power is not good, and we always want to do things like speak truth to power, or we want to use love and overcome power, and so on. And my point was that, well, we'll look at the types of power that are actually bad, but there are types of power that, in a sense, are good.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we say that we want to overcome power, like with truth, the truth itself has power, because it's the power of truth overcoming the power of nasty, vicious, evil approaches. If we say that love is going to be able to stop a nasty form of power, we really mean the power that love has will overcome the power of non-loving, lower approaches and orientations. And there's power going on up even into the spiritual domains. And so one of the ways that we want to distinguish power is indeed in terms of what's its actual overall intent and what's the awareness behind it and how is that being used.
Right.
And under those circumstances, power is something that simply means a genuinely effective capacity at virtually any stage of development that we're at.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is not just power bad, everything else good, but higher, more developed, more inclusive forms of power are better than lower, more egocentric, more selfishly oriented, or even aggressively war-like orientations.
Yeah.
So you can set that up any way you want. We can.
Sure. Sure. Great. Yeah. And Ken, I've always thought that the phrase, speaking truth to power, wasn't intended that truth is somehow like the antithesis of power, but simply that truth and power are two things that really need to be integrated in modern society in order for it to have any real legitimacy.
Yeah.
We need transparent power in a certain kind of sense. So yeah, let's head into power. So Ken, as you know, at the beginning of 2018, we held a major event, and we called it What Now? And the event was largely focused on the issue of power, basically how to cultivate power and how to wield power responsibly, as well as how to navigate a world in which abuse of power has really become impossible to ignore. And when we first began to introduce these topics to the general integral audience, I noticed a lot of enthusiasm for this. There were a lot of people who said something along the lines of like, wow, finally, I've been waiting for years for Integral to come up with a more critical analysis of power. So a lot of people seem to really appreciate that we were sort of heading into those waters. At the same time, we've often criticized liberals, leftists, for focusing really only on these kinds of power dynamics and making this sort of like the only lens that they're willing to enact the world through. As Jonathan Haidt said in a 2017 lecture, I'll just read this quote real briefly. When I was at Yale in the 1980s, I was given so many tools for understanding the world. By the time I graduated, I could think about things as a utilitarian or as a Kantian, as a Freudian or a behaviorist, as a computer scientist or as a humanist. I was given many lenses to apply to any given question or problem. But what do we do now? Many students are given just one lens, power. Here's your lens, kid. Look at everything through this lens. Everything is about power. Every situation is analyzed in terms of the bad people acting to preserve their power and privilege over the good people. This is not an education. This is induction into a cult. It is a fundamentalist religion. It's a paranoid worldview that separates people from each other and sends them down the road to alienation, anxiety, and intellectual impotence. And Ken, I think that we completely agree with Jonathan here. We agree that only looking at the world through a power lens is at best way too narrow, and at worst can really have some catastrophic effects. largely unintentional, but just as catastrophic. And, basically what happens is every person or group of people is seen through this sort of black and white lens of you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, which of course is, the green altitude's MO. There's very, very little room whatsoever for subtlety or shades of gray. And it quickly becomes just another example of how this, highly sophisticated green lens, the green power lens, can actually get hijacked by amber, black and white, us versus them thinking. And this is, also certainly not to say we should ignore the power lens, because it is tremendously important, just that we shouldn't rely on it entirely. As we talked about in last month's episode, Ken, we live in a world that is dominated by these sort of plutocratic interests, these plutocratic forces. And when you live in a world like that, it's essential that we learn how to skillfully criticize and navigate and relate to these kinds of power dynamics. And I've noticed that, one way that this has affected how I have begun to view sort of politics and the culture wars and all that is, a lot of times when we're having these conversations, we talk about, these large swaths of people who can be described as being amber or orange or green or teal and turquoise, et cetera. And I think that continues to be very, very useful. But when I start thinking about specific leaders in either party, no matter where sort of ideologically you kind of fit in, I've begun to think about it as something like, amber red, orange red, green red. And I do that, I insert the red as a reminder to myself that, when a person sort of arrives at this station in life and actually has access to this level of power, the opportunity to seek out even more power and to personally enrich yourselves becomes so seductive, regardless of what sort of where the rest of your views and values are. It becomes so seductive. So I think it's important for us to remember that on an individual basis, when we're talking about everyone from, McConnell to Bernie Sanders, they're all playing this power game in different ways. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, which is not to say that there's not, genuinely good-hearted civil servants out there. There definitely are. But again, in this neoliberal, plutocratic, post-Citizens United world, we've got to be really, really cautious with this. There's a natural cynicism that kind of comes online when it comes to, sort of these unseen intentions among our political leaders. All that said, it seems like, there's a green liberalism, a green leftism is basically, as you say, completely allergic to power in all forms. Whereas a regressive amber leftism tries to surreptitiously kind of exert its own power over others by controlling speech and virtue signaling and, all of this stuff. As I commented a few episodes ago, things have really devolved from, hey, I have a healthy green response. I have a responsibility to try not to offend other people when I'm speaking. That is devolved into, I have the right to never be offended when you speak, which is just another, power move. It's a power flex. And it's kind of shitty because it is exactly, it's so surreptitious. So I'm wondering, what your comments are about this, Ken, whether you think Integral has anything particularly important to say about how we navigate these, what are oftentimes genuinely oppressive systems and oppressive structures of power that, continue to exist. And I'm glad you mentioned the new teaching that you did, because, before you respond, I just want to let people know that we just recorded this new full spectrum power teaching of yours, and we're going to be adding that to the full spectrum mindfulness web course, which continues to grow over time, and we're going to continue feeding this. After we do the power later on down the year, we'll probably do something around full spectrum love, and we'll keep sort of ratcheting up through these major waves of evolution and emergence. But for today's topic, I figured we would really, boil it down to what do we do? How do we interface skillfully with these exterior structures and systems of power?
Yeah, well, here's another case where you really see the nature of intentionality and how important that is with what we just call power. And notice Jonathan Haidt, who is a very, very bright, terrific psychology professor from New York University.
I keep calling him Jonathan Haidt. I should stop doing that.
But almost everything he said was right. And we would, we have a couple other explanatory reasons for why what he was saying. So when he said, for example, that extreme leftist green view is actually a cult, it's actually a fundamentalist religion, that's exactly what we were saying. And there's an actual integral developmental reason for that. If you look at intent in terms of power, and this can go for violence too, is that, again, it's not that either one of those things are just bad in themselves and that we should get rid of them. It's that there really are these, power itself shifts depending on what's driving it. So clearly, if power, it's just, if you just look at it behaviorally, it's just the capacity of one thing to affect and make this thing happen. And then you say, okay, well, what actually are you doing to make happen? Then it's very different if you say, well, what I'm trying to do and bring a lot of power to it is get more Jews into the gas chambers. That's really good. So you bring a lot of power to that, you make that happen. That's not good. But power itself can also be used for any number of good things. And the whole point is, the more power you can bring to that, the more good things you can actually make happen. If you're trying to do something and you have no power at all, you end up doing nothing. So that it's really important to sort of distinguish between power's uses driven by an intention versus the way power has usually been interpreted as trying to do something really bad driven by an evil intention. And it turns out that that's just developmentally, that's a type of intention or desire that can be very common at very early stages of development. One of the things that we notice in development in terms of just these broad stages that I've been talking about, and again, you can do this in a great deal of detail in books like Neuropsychology, Religion of Tomorrow. I actually include about 16 stages overall, but you can summarize those down to 10, or like now we're just using 4 major ones. But all of those get across, to the extent that they convey ideas, they're all correct because they're all reflecting this vast morphogenetic field of evolutionary unfolding that pretty much, as far as we can tell, everything in the universe is exposed to that type of, as I say, universe winding up drive. The earliest stages that are often called egocentric or impulsive, some of the early stages are even called power. So they're self-protective or safety or actual power drives. The third chakra is considered as kind of a power chakra. And it's often viewed as sort of the source of real personal power and drive and capacity. And so a lot of martial arts, for example, focus on the hara, focus on the gut, grounding, and that even Zen focuses on the hara because it's aiming for kind of ultimate empowerment, which is enlightenment of the entire being. And you can see these early, completely self-oriented stages of development. And I always use this example. I've used it a dozen times. So if anybody's read anything by me, they will have heard this. But it's such a good example. I love it. If you take an early child, a couple of years old, and you take a ball that's colored green on one side and red on the other, and put it between you and the child, spin it several times so the child can see it's colored, differently on each side. And then put the green side facing the child and the red side facing you. Ask the child, what color are you seeing? They'll correctly say green. And then say, okay, what color am I seeing? And they'll say green. They really can't even take your perspective. They don't know that you're seeing the world from a different view. Mm-hmm. And so they certainly can't take your view. There's no way that they can even get up to ethnocentric or a group identity with other individual viewpoints because they simply can't really relate to that. So there's kind of emotional gooiness. I mean, the child will say, I love you, mommy, or something like that. But the child has no idea of how mommy is actually looking at the world. And so when that does happen, when that shift does occur, then you can start to identify with entire group or entire groups. And so you can expand your identity from just egocentric, where you're only aware of your own perspective, to being able to take the role of other and be aware of other perspectives. And so you expand into a whole group or group identity with groups. Now you can't go from just being stuck in your own viewpoint to being identified with all groups everywhere in a total universal humanity. So you have to do it kind of step at a time. So you will go through some ethnocentric stages. And then as you get the capacity for those, then you start adding even broader perspectives, third and fourth person perspective. So you really will start to take a view of not just this group or that group, but all groups. And a lot of developmental models actually word the developmental stages in exactly that way. So somebody like Carol Gilligan, the famous feminist thinker who tracked female moral development, has 4 stages of development. And the first she calls selfish. That's just the egocentric. Woman only cares about herself and to hell with everybody else. And then her next stage she calls care, because the woman can actually extend care from herself to others. It's an ethnocentric orientation. It's not all groups. It's just another group or 2 or 3. And then her third stage, she calls not care, but universal care. And that's when the woman does care for all groups, for all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. That's world-centric. That's an actual expansion there. And then her fourth stage, Gilligan calls integrated, because the woman integrates both masculine and feminine modes of thinking, and as well as sort of understanding of all the previous stages. So there's a power at each one of those. And the power is getting more beneficial, certainly more benign, less aggressive or self-centered, or even less ethnocentrically promoting, less bigoted, less prejudiced. And power at world-centric is attempting to bring fairness for all people, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. The more power you have in that, the better you are at helping that happen. You can be at that stage. If you have no power at all, you're not helping. I mean, you're not hurting because you're not out ethnocentrically, trying to burn witches or oppress the opposite sex or hurt some race or something. But you're also not doing much good either. I mean, lack of power is disempowered, absolutely incapable of doing something. So those are important. And one of the ways that we talk about them in just simple shorthand is monological, and then dialogical, and then translogical. So monological means taken from the word monologue, which means you just talk with yourself, and any power that you have is self-driven, self-oriented, self-serving, self-promoting. And to a certain amount, it's healthy because you want to be confident and sure of yourself and stuff like that. But it also has its downsides because it doesn't take an other into account at all. And the really fundamentally low stages of that monological power are still the stages that we had in us that can't even see that you see things from a different perspective. All you can see is my perspective. That's what's right. And the more power I have, the more I'm going to get it. And to hell with you. And literally, high rate of criminals, large percentage of prison populations are at monological stages of power. And so that's a real problem. When you get into dialogical, then that means if you're a man and you're attracted to a woman, if you're in just monological power, then frankly, almost any case of rape is driven by a monological power of sexual impulse. And the man in particular, rare cases, women, but the man simply takes what he wants, forces his monological power on the unsuspecting victim. Not good, not nice. Dialogical power means you actually are in a dialogue with the other. And you attempt to take their point of view, you attempt to see the world the way they're seeing it, and then you attempt to reach some sort of mutual understanding. And that's incredibly important. And stages starting at amber start engaging in dialogue. And that dialogue is even broader and broader as you go from orange into green. You're expanding the number of perspectives that you can dialogue with. And their dialogical power, to the extent that it's operating from a mutual understanding and of mutual goodness, then power is an important part of being able to engage in a healthy and effective way in implementing those values, those capacities, and those moral interactions. And almost, the more power, the better. And there, it's even when we say, well, we have to overcome power, what we really mean is we have to use dialogical power to overcome monological power. Because if it's not power, it won't work. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So we're using a higher, more moral, more encompassing power to overcome a lesser, selfish, more dangerous kind of power. Almost universally, power tends to be equated with just monological power. And that's a real problem. Power does continue to extend all the way into states of waking up, have various kinds of power. I mean, most of the tantric traditions and spirituality actually have a type of energetic power that's said to correspond to states of spiritual awakening. So Kundalini is a classic example. That's an actual, it's known as a serpent power. And it's said to be wrapped around the first chakra. And when you start to get awakened in your upper left quadrant, your consciousness starts to become awakened. Then Kundalini power in the upper right, which is an actual kind of energetic force, that's arising simultaneously, and these go together. And that's so power runs the whole spectrum in that sense. And what we, again, semantically usually mean by power are just the very, very earliest and monological stages of that. And those can be implemented without even any discussion with the other person. You really don't care to discuss the issue. It's not necessary. And if you really tapped in, if you really tapped in that monological power, you couldn't take their perspective anyway. You think they see the same green that you see. So not a problem. I can do whatever I want. It's horrifying. Even green, because it has this power narrative that is going to explain how all these other groups got oppressed. The only way that can happen is with power. And so they do have a whole meta narrative of power. That's how history is to be understood. And that's all it really is, including between the sexes. It's nothing but a power play. And in all cases, according to Broken Green, in terms of sexes, in all cases, men oppressed women, and that's it. So it was the men exerting their power over women and forcing them and controlling them, and that was the end of the story. And there were no exceptions. Mm-hmm. And that's really, that's an insanely regressive viewpoint. But they are engaging in healthy form green power. Mm-hmm. The problem is, as soon as it becomes regressive at all, it becomes monological power. And that's why you see in particularly most of the protesters on campus and stuff like that, they are exercising just this brutal monological power. And it's truly monological because, again, they don't even want to talk to the other side. Right. They don't have to. They know they're wrong. And they're actually protesting, not even to try and get some sort of university agreement on doing something more moral. They're protesting and using a heckler's veto simply to shut up the other side. That's all they want. You just force them out, force them off the stage, force them to not be able to say anything, to not be able to present their viewpoints, even though they represent about 50% of the population. They're taken as nasty, vicious terrorists. That is what originated as a dialogical power regressing into a monological brutality of power. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, that's a problem. It's a real problem. But what we want to be careful to do, well, and then just briefly, a translogical power is one that continues into even higher stages, including third tier, and also can apply to things like waking up that embraces those things. And so what we generally mean by power is that bad power is monological, good power is dialogical, and translogical transcends and includes both of those and is better in that sense because it's going to be operating always including a good orientation as well as adding a sort of even better orientation, if you will. But we have power going all the way up, all the way down the stages of development. And one of the basic takeaway items here is as you are attempting to help make the world a better place, as you're attempting to make yourself a better person, that you don't want to simply look at any form of what feels in you like power. You don't want to just throw that out because it's also a drive of, again, effectiveness. It's a power of confidence and it's a power of competency. To competently get something done. And that's an extraordinary ingredient in virtually any form of success. Whether you're a novelist or a doctor or a lawyer or a waiter. So power as capacity to get work done is an incredibly important function that we have. And it applies to whatever level or structure of development that we're at. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably one of the areas that human beings have just in general shown the most amount of confusion over. And the main reason is that monological power is so brutal and is so vicious. So even ethnocentric groups like everybody's example is always the Nazis. So fine, the Nazis. Nazis didn't want to talk with the Jews. They didn't want to have mutual understanding. They didn't want to dialogue with them. So even though they were at ethnocentric stages, they were not using a dialogical power. They had just turned the whole Jewish class was treated with a monological power. I just take you and do what I want. And by the way, I want you to lead it. So please just get in line for this gas chamber and we'll take care of that. That's always been so horrid, whether it's being displayed by a Genghis Khan or Ramses or Sargon. They're always exercising monological power in terms of their capacity to brutally eradicate often entire cultures. And they're rather happy about it for the most part. And that's just come to really epitomize human evil and the capacity of humans to do evil. And all of that's no argument. Those are all absolutely horrid and malevolent evils even.
Yeah.
But we can't confuse all power with doing just that.
Right.
It's a real confusion that people have, and it's really something that you want to. It really makes a difference in terms of how you look at your own, allowing yourself to be powerful in something. Just the thought that, wait, I can really exercise power here. And if I'm doing it within the understanding of others, and I'm not violating somebody's rights, I have an understanding of where they are on the situation. And particularly if you're operating in concert with somebody else, you do want to reach an actual mutual understanding about common goals. And so then if you do that, you want to engage that with as much effectiveness and as much power as you can. So it really can change a way that a person will introspect and feel their own being, feel their own awareness, feel their own capacities.
Oh, that was so beautiful. That was so beautiful. And I'm over here, I'm listening to you talk, and I'm taking it as like pointing out instructions, you know, because I'm one of those people who does want to be a positive force for change in the world. And I'm someone who's attracted to people like you, who have a very particular form of power. And I'm beginning to feel more and more how if I don't discover that source of power within myself, I remain ineffective. And in a lot of ways, Ken, me even, you know, trying to do this show with you and getting in front of the camera over the last year and all that, there's so many insecurities and performance anxieties and imposter syndromes and all that I need to push through. And I need a sense of power in order to push through so that I can feel like I'm actually getting my hands on something important. And so that I can allow this translogical power to hopefully start, you know, having a place to go, having a channel, and having, you know, because really ultimately, Ken, power is I think most universally, power is the ability to use energy to either change or move or shape, and in some cases create matter. Yep. And I think that this is a very important point for the integral audience in particular, and why it's so important for the integral audience to overcome whatever sort of residual allergies to power they may have. Because when I look at the integral community, I see a whole lot of energy, but I also see a whole lot of people who are still trying to figure out where their power is actually coming from and how to exert it in the world in such a way that it actually does move the needle and make a difference. So
yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
All right. So our next issue is privilege.
Right.
Which very naturally follows after power. And I think, Ken, this is another area where an integral view can probably very quickly clean up just a ton of confusions and misunderstandings around the notion of privilege. I think that, you know, like most liberal values that we've been talking about here, this idea of privilege came from a legitimately good place, a healthy place. And it represents a very important, but, you know, somewhat nuanced kind of cultural injunction for all of us to, you know, really simply reflect on how much of our lives have benefited from certain unseen privileges that come from, being born into a particular race or a particular gender or economic class or what have you. And also to reflect on just simply the fact that there are other people that we're surrounded by who have not benefited from those same hidden privileges. And like most of the liberal values, especially the ones we've been discussing, it's a notion that really, it gets quickly twisted and abused and manipulated by both regressive liberals and regressive conservatives, both of whom really see something like privilege as being this like bumper sticker euphemism for fuck white people, and once again, these green level platitudes are being used by people who are not themselves capable of showing the math, of actually being able to, they're not capable of the green level cognition from which these kinds of, values are emerging in the first place. So the signal gets totally, lost in the noise, I think. And, in a lot of ways, Ken, whenever I start talking about privilege from an integral point of view, it reminds me of, all the times that you have explored the Marxist idea of a false consciousness, which basically means, and I'm sure you'll tell us more, but basically means that, it's a lack of awareness around how much of our conscious self is constructed from elements that remain mostly unconscious. So, I mean, that can be, the techno-economic platform that you're brought into. I'm thinking of several conversations ago when we were talking about how social media is actually sort of reshaping how we relate to each other and how we engage a lot of these issues. A lot of that is a good example of this false consciousness, because we're not necessarily aware of this sort of architecture of thinking that is being imposed upon us by the technologies that we're immersed in. And this false consciousness can come from anywhere within these four quadrants. Really, at its core, I think that the phrase, check your privilege, what it ultimately means, in its healthiest expression, what it really means is check your false consciousness. Take an introspective look and see if you can identify those pieces of your identity, those pieces of yourself that really you had no role in creating or manufacturing or anything like that in the first place. They were largely handed to you, and you take them as sort of this central piece of your identity. And recognize again that other people haven't had that, that same opportunity. So really, I think, as you mentioned earlier, this has nothing at all to do with phrases like white privilege. This comes down to majority privilege. It's not saying that white people are inherently more privileged. It's saying that here in America, white people are the majority culture and therefore tend to be inherently more privileged. It's the form that majority privilege tends to take in this culture, in this society. If we were living in China, we'd be talking about Chinese privilege. And of course, because the concept of privilege really is not black and white, at least not in the way that, these regressive kind of elements are making it out to be, within a single society, we can talk about men's privilege, women's privilege, black privilege. I mean, there's any number of subcultural groups who have certain privileges in certain contexts and are missing certain privileges in other contexts. So it becomes a really fascinating issue, I think. And so I started introspecting and wondering, why was this such a lightning rod? Why did this concept, which again I think really does come from a mature and fairly sophisticated green altitude, why did this get so quickly corrupted and twisted in these culture wars? And I think that it really comes down to a few factors. There's a general green proclivity towards, victim versus oppressor narratives. And a lot of times when you're enacting that lens, you can only ever be 100% victim or 100% oppressor. There's really not a lot of room for nuance here. I think that is also the fact that the concept of white privilege really started, hit its saturation point in the midst of the Black Lives Matter debates, which I think made things that much trickier. There's the fact that, as you talked about earlier, every altitude comes with its increasingly larger sphere of care and compassion, which means that it's very easy to have two different groups of people using a common phrase like privilege and completely speaking across each other. really it doesn't mean the same thing to both groups of people. I think there's the fact that liberals, and this I find to be a really interesting point. Liberals are very hesitant to criticize the views and the values and the behaviors of other cultures. But they're very eager, oftentimes, to criticize the same within their own group. So they become overly tolerant of bad elements within other cultures, but hypersensitive to problematic issues within their own culture. In this case, with white male American culture, Greens feel free to criticize that and even use hierarchical judgments in their this is better than that, and I will use shame in order to make sure you understand why this approach is better than your approach, and so forth. But when it comes to looking at other cultures, there's no shame, there's no hierarchy, there's no discernment of what is more or less appropriate, and that becomes a big problem. On the other side of the aisle, conservatives tend to be very quick to criticize other cultures, but tremendously resistant when it comes to criticizing their own, which makes a lot of sense considering what ethnocentric means, what it is. We're awesome, you're not, deal with it. Be more like us and maybe you can be awesome too. So somewhere in that crossfire, Ken, I think that a legitimately sophisticated postmodern concept of privilege, majority privilege, has devolved into this pre-modern identity politics of white privilege. And as usual, the baby gets completely lost with the bathwater. And I'm wondering if you think it's worthwhile trying to save that baby.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problems, again, with so many of the issues that we face today is that we really don't have a very good understanding of the actual historical development over thousands and thousands of years. And the whole point about sort of evolutionary theory in general is just this general idea of a competition for survival. Mm-hmm. Certain groups have certain advantages, not necessarily in a universal sense or in absolute sense or even in a moral sense, but certainly in just a local competitive sense. Certain groups win over other groups. It might just be an expression of power, but there's something that makes most groups that win have some kind of, at least in that circumstance, some kind of exceptional capacity that lets them do that. It's certainly true of football teams and basketball teams and et cetera. So the same thing was happening historically. Now, it just turns out, as we were talking earlier, that for whatever reason, worldwide, the first culture that really started to talk about universal rights of all people and that all people should be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. Now, for whatever reason, the group that first, in a large scale, devised that idea were a group of white, cisgendered, European males.
Those devils.
Yeah. And as I say, because for whatever reason that they had been in power, nonetheless, they also created these notions that would, in effect, relieve them of power if applied the way the principles are meant to be applied. And that's actually what started happening. So we did start to see an extension of the vote to other minorities. Never happened before. We saw a demand that everybody be included. It started with all men are created equal, and literally meaning males. That could extend to all males and females of any race, of any ethnicity, of any gender, however you want to conceive that. This is unheard of. But again, the culture had been created around a majority rule because that's what all cultures do. there really just isn't a minority rule of a culture. You don't get to rule a culture if you're just a small, ineffectual slice of it. So in some ways, some of the things that we call privilege are a historical exceptionalism that is no longer appropriate to be recognized as exceptional. And so there's still that transition that needs to be made. And I gave some examples earlier about how we are making those transitions in an enormous number of ways. And like I said, we already have laws that make it categorically illegal for any person to marginalize, mistreat unfairly any race, any sex, any gender, any ethnicity. It's against the law. Now, the problem is that almost nobody at first here, that includes olive green and olive orange, if you're just looking at the law, that's what governs your exterior behavior in the public sphere. It doesn't cover your interior.
Right.
And the interior is where all that intent is, and all those identities going from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integrated. None of those make it into an observable public sphere. So you can't see the necessity of those to get to the level of values that you're embracing and that you want everybody else to embrace.
Right.
And so that becomes a real issue. And so one of the things that is, as usual, green is that, particularly because it's a largely broken green today. And I want to keep emphasizing that I'm really not even talking about healthy green. But it's really an extremist, broken green that does have a regressive tendency and tends to take its relativistic ideas. Because if you really have a relativistic idea, and so you really don't think that it can be forced on anybody else because there's really no difference, everybody's equally relative. So how could you possibly say that you want your relativity forced on other relativities? It absolutely contradictory, makes no sense at all. So the more you get really wound up about this, and the more zealous you get about your relative view, the more you make it absolutistic, and the more you end up where absolutism feels good, which is at amber ethnocentric stages of development, and you are part of the regressive left. And that's a real issue. And interestingly, orange liberal per se doesn't tend to get caught in that sort of extremist absolutism. It doesn't regress that much. So we really do have the sort of low-ish leveled ethnocentric poem of things like real neo-Nazis and real KKK and real white supremacists. And there are real black supremacists and across the board. There are feminists that there's a op-ed in, it's either the New York Times or the op-ed Post, head of women's studies at Northeastern, something like that, wrote how it was appropriate for women to absolutely hate every single man in existence, all of them, not just few, all of them. And that every white man should just quit his job, stop assuming any form of power. So I mean, that's about as ethnocentrically prejudiced and bigoted as you can get. So what we're in the process of doing is continually attempting to extend the rights of even a majority privilege to more and more minorities. And that's something that actually has to be done. And because it's not where human beings started out.
Right.
It's where they evolved after some 300,000 years of evolution. And again, getting up to the point of even getting over something like slavery. It's only 150 years ago that happened. And that's just human nature struggling to work it out. But on the long haul, headed in the right direction, and that's encouraging. But so right now, the idea of things like white privilege, or even masculine privilege, really is much more a holdover from earlier epochs of our historical development, when something like that was not only common, but there was really no real way around it.
Right.
And so now part of our growth is learning to extend those. And that's what we're doing. And really, particularly starting with the 60s, and the boomers get some credit for it, not all. But there really was this expansion in the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, the whole feminist movement. And by the way, a lot of even feminist writers like Janet Chaffetz, for example, and we've talked about this briefly, but as she was tracking male and female relative privileges in earlier techno-economic modes of development, looking at how they were related in foraging, then horticulture, then agrarian, then industrial, and into informational. And she could see that there were often dramatic shifts in how the sexes ended up relating, and how they would have what we would consider a type of power. So in original foraging tribes, men and women tended to follow fairly biological roles. Mm-hmm. So men tended to be warriors and hunters. Women tended to give birth and nurture young. Mm-hmm. When we got into horticultural was one of the interesting shifts, because what horticulture was the beginning of farming. And the way you do that was with a simple digging stick or hoe. And even pregnant women could do that. And Janet Chaffetz, who is in essence a sort of feminist systems theorist, and I love her work, I've drawn on it a lot. She points out that in horticultural societies, women produce about 80% of foodstuffs. And that's reflected in an almost Marxist way. And the fact that about a third of horticultural societies have female-only deities. These are the great matriarchies, the great societies of great mother worship or great goddess worship. And then about a third of the societies had male and female deities. So women were a large part of the productive public force at that point. Mm-hmm. A huge shift occurs with agrarian, because agrarian is farming with a really heavy animal-drawn plow, an ox or a horse or water buffalo, something like that. And women that do that had extremely high rates of miscarriage. And they chose, were not forced, they chose to not do that. And so all of a sudden, men are producing about 95% of the foodstuffs and are in the public sphere, and women are remaining more in the reproductive private sphere. Nobody's being oppressed here. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that certain kinds of oppression couldn't occur, mm-hmm. but that's not what Janet Chaffetz was tracking. She was tracking the choices that women made to co-create the societies that they were in. And by the way, assuming that they were only repressed from day one doesn't paint just a horrible picture of men as oppressive pigs. It paints a worse picture of women having no agency, no choice. And it's one of the main problems with feminism is they deny agency to women. Everything that happens to them is because somebody else is doing it to them. Like they have no capacity or will or power on their own. It's a horribly degrading view of women. So men and women chose these various types of orientations. And yes, there could be certain types of oppression. But in many cases, if you look at, I mean, this is even going back to people like John Stuart Mill, who took a poll of his female readers and asked how many want the vote, how many want to be a vote, and most of them said they didn't want it. Every feminist will say, well, she's internalized patriarchy. By the way, what we would call patriarchy, in terms of just a male public productive force, began with agrarian cultures. And about 95% of agrarian cultures have male-only deities. So you see a real switch from great mother horticultural society to great father patriarchal orientation. The industrial age, next up, started to reduce that dramatically, because what machines did was remove the selection of male physical strength. That is one of the differences between men and women, is men, on average, biologically have greater upper body strength. And so, in essence, what the women did in agrarian times is say, hell, I'm not plowing that field. You, Mr. Muscles, you go do it. I'm staying here and take care of the kids. But industrial organization, machines, started to do the work on nature that previously men's upper body strength had to do. Yep. That's why we really started to see the emancipation movements. We saw the first forms of feminism. John Stuart Mill had asked the women leaders, do you want to get the vote right now? And the majority of them said no. And one of the reasons is in most of the cultures during that period, in order to be a citizen of a country, you had to participate in the military. And most women just didn't want to do that. And one of the statistical differences between men and women is men's capacity to be more aggressive. And therefore, it's relatively accurate to describe human warfare as male warfare. Men picked fights with other men and killed other men, and women just sort of sat aside. Often they would cheer, choose sides, of course, and support it, but they weren't actually that much involved in the actual fighting and killing itself. When we get to male and female toxicity, we'll see that women can actually express a great deal of hostility and aggression, particularly if there's the old saying, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Yep. So we see some of the statistics on domestic violence, because they're shocking. But you start to with the rise of industrial, which had its corresponding interior fundamentally at orange. And so that's why we started to get world-centric moral developments, freeing of slaves, beginning of liberation, women's liberation movements, and so on. And all of that became possible with the rise of an industrial techno-economic base. And then as we moved into an informational base, then that tended to free it up even more, but then also did start to allow individual differences in interests to come to the fore in a really large way. And so one of the things that we'll also see when we talk about sex and gender is, and this is considered, the London Times said that this is one of the most solid and established facts in all of social science. But the more egalitarian cultures become, such as Scandinavia, the greater the differences between men and women.
Interesting.
It was exactly the opposite of what they thought would happen. And because all this research was done by leftists, by the way, and they were shocked by the results. But it's been done with it's been done with entire country populations. And as the London Times said, there are pretty much no exceptions to this. But as Scandinavian countries made their culture more egalitarian, so men and women were treated the same culturally, all that was left was their biological differences, and those became greater.
Right.
And so in something like engineering in Scandinavia, the ratio of men to women is 20 to 1. In professions like nursing, it's the reverse. The men, 20 times more women than men. Those differences are becoming greater. It's not a difference in capacity. It's just a difference in interest,
right?
What one want to do. Men do seem to have a greater interest. Well, the single largest difference ever discovered between men and women is that women are interested in people and men are interested in things. And things means dead, inanimate things, including intellectual things, mathematics, physics, chemistry. When you start to introduce life, like biology, psychology, social, there are more women in those than men. But for all the dead things, way more men. And they do much more fun. It's just one of those things. And this instantly shows up on day one. Baby boy infants and baby girl infants at day one show that difference. They show that difference at every period of their life until they die. And it's true in every culture we've ever tested. Right. It's a stunning difference. So what is those kinds of differences are not due to any sort of privilege in an oppressive sense. I mean, if it was, and again, the feminists would be very upset that 61% of college degrees are going to women, that still women dominate in disciplines that work with people, and men dominate in discipline, STEM fields, for example. Technology, engineering, mathematics. Sciences, yes, working with dead things. Sciences working with people, women dominate those.
Right.
At what point do we start saying those are privileges?
Right.
Because each sort of group has a capacity for different sort of exceptional capacities. And so there are, I don't think short Jewish guys are going to have much chance getting into the NBA. And there's a large percentage of Black men that are. So is that Black privilege? Well, in a certain sense, in terms of at least in that field, a certain type of athletic capacity. The difficulty still remains that because the culture originally was run by white male, cisgendered, heterosexual men, that's still taken to be the major form of oppression that there is. And it really does overlook, as you were saying, pretty much every group to some extent oppresses to some degree other groups. And every group, without exception, is a victim of some sort of oppression from other groups or consortia of other groups. And that's becoming just more and more dispersed. And the fact that there's just nothing but toxic masculinity and all of it's toxic, and that all women should hate all men, that it's nothing but a white oppressive society, and it's racist to the core. The charge is made by the far left. Every time you disagree with them on anything, you just automatically are racist or sexist. That pretty much exhausts their arguments.
Yeah.
And it's really outrageous. Again, it's, if you had white privilege and you went to China, see how far your white privilege gets you. It's not an inherent thing.
Right.
You're just born with, and you get to lord over everybody. It's entirely culturally contextual. And it's we're one of the cultures that has increasingly made it illegal to engage in any of those forms of exceptional privilege. It's just not fundamentally allowed. And what we still haven't dealt with and might never be able to figure out is some of these inherent interest differences that almost every group has.
Right.
And there's almost nothing you can do about that. But to simply keep saying, for example, that white privilege means that whites dominate in all forms of income. For example, there's actually a list of the top income groups in this country. They are, the average American makes $48,000 a year. The two highest group in terms of income are Filipino Americans and Taiwanese. The typical Japanese American makes $70,000 on average a year. Again, this is compared to $48,000 for the average white American.
Mm-hmm.
Even French Americans make $63,000 a year. Iranian Americans make $66,000 a year. Dutch, $59,000 a year. Even Nigerians, blacks in this country, $61,000 a year average. And people from Ghana, $57,000 average a year. All of those are higher than white Americans. So you can't just say black people automatically don't make as much. It's just not true. And we're increasingly putting in place lower right quadrant structures, laws, rules, and regulations that curb that kind of thing. And what we'll still always be open to is allowing people to express their own, whatever capacities they have that are genuinely different. Right. And the disaster, if you want everybody to finish the race at the same time, is you wipe out all of those. And that's the real nightmare. And that's part of the problem that we get from the regressive left nowadays. Overlooking their own power, their own drive, and their own wishes and beliefs that they're actually superior.
Right. Yeah. Oh, Ken, that's awesome. You know, what really sort of comes forward for me is how, you know, there are some outcomes that are indeed a result of privilege. There are other outcomes that are the result of predisposition. And the problem occurs when we confuse privilege with predisposition. Right. And an extreme, extreme green kind of view is that it sort of flattens all predispositions. It says, well, no, all human beings are born a blank slate. And there are, you know, if you're, you know, if you have certain racial predispositions or biological or, you know, gender-based predispositions or even cultural predispositions, as you're talking about Japanese Americans versus Iranian Americans and so forth, then you're committing some sort of egregious sin against liberalism, because you're supposed to assume that everyone is just, you know, everyone is the same. And therefore, if everyone's not hitting the finish line at the same time, that's because, you know, these guys are overprivileged and these guys are underprivileged and all that. When it might be like, well, you guys are, there's not only one race, there's like 50 different races that you guys should be measuring. And in fact, just to briefly return to, we were talking about sort of, you know, equal opportunity versus equal outcome. Equal outcome, I think, can be used in a healthy way if you're using it as a yardstick to see if your assumptions about equal opportunity turn out to be true. Because all things being the same in a given generic race, if everyone is starting at the same, you know, the starting line, then on average, people should be hitting the finish line about the same. If they don't, you're left with a few questions. Do we actually have, you know, unequal opportunity? Is our whole formulation of equal opportunity somewhat skewed? B, are we measuring the wrong race here? Is this, you know, I mean, if we expect, you know, there to be 50% men nurses, and it turns out in America there's, you know, 75% or something like that, are we gonna skew that conversation into like, well, this is because women are more privileged than men in this area? Or are we going to simply say this type of person has a predisposition to run this kind of race and less of a predisposition to run that race? And I think these are really important subtleties that we need to add to the conversation.
Well, and let me just interject briefly on that. I was earlier talking about some of the appropriate uses of equal outcome.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the fact that, like, in 1970, 61% of college degrees were going to men. and only 39% to women. That was a real difference in equal outcome. And we looked at that and we said, something's wrong.
Right.
And so we really started working on equal opportunity to try to get more women in the door. And we put a lot of policies in place in the educational system. And still to this day, they're at every grade from 1 to 12 and then into college. There are organizations that help women in terms of their education and what to do and ways to boost what they're doing. There are virtually none for boys. I mean, it's so bad that there are a lot of books coming out like Warren Farrell's The Boy Crisis or Christina Hoff Sommers' The War on Boys. It actually has gotten quite bad in that sense.
Yeah.
But equal outcome can be an indication that something is not right. Mm-hmm. And so you particularly, even if you have equal opportunity and everybody gets a chance to line up, and then you fire the gun, and a particular group is consistently finishing behind other groups, then you have a right to say, okay, maybe we're actually looking at some intrinsic differences here. Then the question is, are those differences, were they created because of the way that they were treated poorly in the culture at large? And then if so, that's bad. Right. You can make the argument that years of slavery tended to, and I mean, for a couple of centuries, it was illegal for a Black person to read. If they had a book, they could get killed. Yeah. You can argue that that slowed down some of their capacity to just get into college and absolutely excel. So you have to look at those reasons carefully. Yeah. On the other hand, if you're running the race and 95% of men finish ahead of 95% of women, that turns out probably not to be the case that women were mistreated. It turns out to be the case that there are some inherent differences between male biology and female biology, so much so that we divide those races. We have male and female sports. We realize it's not fair to put those together. Whereas a strict equal outcome would say, oh yeah, we have to do that until there are just as many women NFL teams winning the Super Bowl as there are men. Yeah. And that could take a little bit of doing, but it would follow from a standard green agenda. So we do have to look at that carefully. Yeah. And if everybody really is, getting some sort of equal opportunity, but they're consistently not finishing along with everybody else, then we do have the right to do things, for example, like not quotas, but a type of affirmative action to get more people up to that finish line, that starting line, so that there's a greater chance for more to succeed. Yep. And that, those are important considerations. And
totally. And Ken, I think the other thing that this really foregrounds for me is how impossible it is to actually come to understand this stuff without the four quadrants. And not even just the four quadrants as sort of this static, object, but like to really observe the feedback loops that exist between all of these quadrants. So, in the examples that we're citing here, basically what happens is you get a few men, historically, usually white men in the upper left quadrant, get turned on to a new way of thinking. And those same individuals, let's just say individuals, those historically it was often men, but we'll just say individuals, those individuals have access to a certain type of power. And that power allows them to enact these new visions in the lower right quadrant. They create new laws or what have you. And of course, the lower right quadrant it changes faster than any other quadrant out there. So we get this new set of laws in the lower right. As you say, it is illegal to pay women any less than men. It's illegal to have discriminatory hiring practices. All these things are codified in the lower right quadrant, which begins regulating behavior in the upper right quadrant. However, the left-hand quadrants lag behind. There's an inertia, as you were talking about. This concept of privilege. It's residue. It's residue from old ways of thinking that have not yet been able to rise to the occasion that is being set by the lower right quadrant. And so you get this, you know, in our very first episode, we talked about how so much of feminism was actually, especially early feminism, was exactly that. It was a response to the slower inertia in the left-hand quadrants, which couldn't quite keep pace with the rate of change that was happening in the right-hand quadrant. So suddenly in the right-hand quadrants, women are allowed to vote, women are allowed to work, women can become main breadwinners in their family. I mean, all of these
birth control pill was staggering.
Huge, tremendous power, you know, steps forward in terms of their own empowerment in the public sphere. Absolutely. And yet there was inertia on behalf of a lot of men who were slow to accept women coming into the public sphere. And we used the example in that first episode of how the same continues to be true in the private sphere, where it is seen as noble and good for a woman to go out and find a career and all that. Men are often emasculated if they prefer staying at home and raising the kids and being, you know, with the family. So there actually is sort of women's privilege continue today within the private sphere. And so all of this really does come down to the fact that there's an inertia where the left-hand quadrants are a bit slower to evolve and to transform than the right quadrants usually are. And from that lag between the two, that's where we get concepts like privilege.
Well, the whole point about left hand lagging behind right hand, this was actually the fundamental insight of Marx. That's actually what he wrote about. And what he noticed was, of course, he tended to be materialistically oriented, so-called dialectical materialism, which were schools that had developed after Hegel had, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel had introduced these stunningly amazing developmental views of reality. And they were the first really evolutionary thinkers, philosophers in history, and were really tracking stages of development, which is a radically new idea. And it was actually from them that the ideas seeped out. And several decades later, people like Charles Darwin went out and was looking for that in biology. But those are really sort of amazing points of view, because all of the German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all had a conception of spiritual dimensions. And in the wake of that, the materialists said, no, wait, there's not just spiritual, it's all material development. So Marx tracked historical development through a couple of stages of development, from archaic and what he even felt were sort of early communist forms, and then up into eventually the Middle Ages and the whole feudalistic stage. And it was his materialist orientation was that it was the windmills that created a feudal lord, for example. So it was tracking that. But what he noticed is that these technological artifacts can be produced much faster than humans can orient to them. So what happens is you get a culture that's adapted, created by a particular techno-economic base, might be windmills, and then a very small number of people introduce the next technological development, and they'll start building it, and then a small culture will grow up around that new technological development. And as that continues, the tension between these two becomes profound, because the old technological culture has the power, but the new ones are at a higher level of development, and eventually there's a revolution and the higher stage takes over. And that's what he traced. And of course, he felt capitalism was going to be superseded by a communistic orientation. And so that still tends to be the case. That's as everybody has some partial truths. Marx was onto a true but partial kind of notion. What we see, though, is that there are indeed all of these structural factors that are put in place in the lower right. And they are put in place first. The internet was there before social media and the echo chambers of polarization. And
Right.
that just, it happened like that. So one of the things that's happened is that if you take something like poverty and you say, okay, now with all of these new laws and rules and regulations in place, what's going to actually cause poverty? The people that are actually in poverty in this country, what do they all have in common? And there have been several think tanks, left and right, Brookings, Hoover, all of them, have actually done statistical analysis of people that are poor and people that aren't poor, and what you have to do to not be poor in this country. And all of them agree there are just three things. If you finish high school, if you get a job, any job, flipping burgers, it doesn't matter. If you get a job and don't have a kid out of wedlock, you do just those three things, there's less than a 5% chance you'll be in poverty. The number of two-parent Black families below the poverty line is 6%. The number of single white female families under the poverty line is 22%. Mm. Where's white privilege?
Right.
So, and by the way, those three factors, not one of them says be white, not Black.
Right.
Not one of them says be male, not female.
Yeah.
Racism and sexism aren't even in that picture anymore.
Right.
Where the hell is the white privilege?
Right.
It's nowhere. So where's the masculine privilege? It's nowhere, not in that kind of regard. And those kinds of things are spreading. So we're still going to see individual differences, and to the extent that they're there, whatever group differences are there. And that's the factor that we have to face in the coming years is, again, what of those, why is somebody finishing a race ahead of somebody else? Is it oppression or is it some sort of capacity? And that's a difficult question. I don't want broken green answering that question. I want teal answering that question.
Amen. So. Amen. Well, speaking of having teal and turquoise answering very difficult questions, let's move on to sex and gender.
Yeah.
So, Ken, one of the things that I think I thought was really cool in the last conversation we had was we pointed to the fact that, you know, and I really consider this to be one of the legitimate triumphs of green, of postmodernism itself, which is the fact that they were successful in differentiating the concept of sex from the concept of gender. And I think that's a really, really important step in the right direction, because this offers a more sophisticated and a more nuanced view of our sexuality than we see in, for example, the extreme conservative, there are only two genders kind of attitude that was so common with previous altitudes. And of course, I think an integral conversation about sexual identity fleshes this out even more and brings us, again, to something more resembling a 4-quadrant appreciation of human sexuality in all of its dimensions, which includes things like, in the upper right, biological sex is real. And this includes things like male, female, and very rarely intersex. In the upper left quadrant, we've got things like sexual orientation, which can be, homosexual, bisexual, heterosexual, and each of those exists in both sexual and romantic domains. So a woman might be sexually attracted to other women, but would never want a romantic relationship with those other women, for example. That's an important piece of nuance that I think that postmodernism has added to the puzzle. There's in the upper left also, in that sort of David Data sense, a person's sexual essence. Are they, sort of naturally more masculine, naturally more feminine? It's often the case that males are more masculine and females are more feminine, but not always. That's not destiny by any means. And then, you've got the relationship between the upper left and the upper right, which is known as gender identity, cisgender versus transgender. In other words, does my upper left sexual identity correlate with my upper right biological sex? If yes, I'm cisgendered. If not, I'm transgendered.
Right.
In the lower left, we've got all of these culturally defined gender roles, man and women, that shift, pretty dramatically from altitude to altitude. So an amber culture enacts the gender roles for men and women differently than green does. In the lower right quadrant, we've got, techno-economic influences. As we're saying, post-industrial revolution, women had an opportunity to expand their identities as women because of the freedoms that our techno-economic base afforded them. And that is awesome. Also in the lower right quadrant, we've got sort of on a more granular level, we've got, the political, legal, and economic conditions that both men and women are dealing with: wages, affirmative action programs, sexual harassment policies, etc. All of these taken together, and I'm sure there are at least a half dozen others we could add into the mix. But all of these, I think they really help us get a much more accurate definition of what someone's sexual cosmic address is in a certain kind of sense. And it sounds like a lot, but human sexuality is massively complex, and this is probably the minimum amount of categories that we need in order to really get a handle on that. So that's the good news, I think, Ken, is that postmodernism has begun to differentiate many of these qualities. And I think a healthy postmodernism, a healthy green altitude, is perfectly capable of holding both, biological determinants in the upper right and cultural determinants in, say, the lower left simultaneously. The bad news is there's not a whole lot of healthy postmodernism that we see in the world. And I think because of that, this conversation really quickly slides basically from one type of quadrant absolutism, only biology is real, to another kind of quadrant absolutism, which is only culture is real. And, when that happens, gender itself really does get deconstructed, pretty much to oblivion. It doesn't have any meaning anymore, resulting in, a phrase that I often use is Tumblr feminism, which has, like 320 different gender categories that range from, labels that have been around for a while, like gay and straight and bisexual, to sort of newer terms like sapiosexual and cisgendered. And then, all the way to what, I guess we'll just call some avant-garde labels like furries and xenogender and, a half dozen different shades of I'm sexually attracted to dragons.
Yeah.
And you really do.
Who isn't?
I've always been a bit of a unicorn file myself, but that's just me. And it sounds silly, but no, you see this shit out there, and it's in these, little liberal, again, it's on sites like Tumblr, these little echo chambers, and I'm not sure how much, they're often made fun of by conservatives and, kind of more sane liberals alike, but it's out there. It's definitely out there. And because of this slide into quadrant absolutism, folks like Jordan Peterson, he has gone so far as to call many extreme feminist thinkers biology deniers, which oftentimes they are. However, I'll say that Jordan himself doesn't really seem to have a robust four quadrant kind of appreciation of how these factors do co-arise and why they can't easily be, reduced to each other. So on the one hand, it seems, perfectly okay. Again, this is where I can totally get on board the postmodern project. It is perfectly okay to bring some more granularity to how we, categorize ourselves, to these categories of sexual attraction and identity and sexual behavior. But on the other hand, the minute we begin to deny or downplay any of these other, fundamental four quadrant dimensions of our sexuality, we exacerbate the confusion. We create more division between us. It's what we talked about a month or two ago. It's amber identity politics being brought into the sexual realm, and it's not liberating. In fact, you can make a lot of arguments for how liberals, in a lot of ways, are killing the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So, I've got a follow-up question, Ken, after this about toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, et cetera. But I'm wondering what you think about all this. Human sexuality is so messy in the first place. And, you know, usually the messier it is, the better, the better the sex is. But, you know, I'm wondering if we can clean up some of the mess without losing any of the fun.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right that one of the most important things that has to be done is to, at the very least, consider a 4-quadrant approach. Of course, ideally, we look at quadrants and levels and lines and states and types and so on. And indeed, that in a certain sense, that can get complex, although I think ultimately it introduces a great deal of simplicity into an enormously complex world. But we do have a fair number of categories. And the fact is, again, that those all happen to actually be there. Those factors are real. They're happening. The amount of evidence on each and one of those factors that I've introduced, I've done so because the amount of evidence from certain knowledge communities is overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And nobody in those communities doubts the existence of those factors. One of the problems is very few of those communities know what the other communities are doing, which is fairly common. So we really don't get these things put together, which is what we try to do with an integral approach. But certainly when you come to feminism, not only is it the case that there are different schools of feminism that spring from each quadrant, but very, very rarely does any school of feminism, no school that I know of, include them all. And one of the things that happens when you have a quadrant favoritism, let alone a quadrant absolutism, is you deny realities to the others. And that's what Peterson is talking about when he says that many modern feminists deny biology. And one of the reasons they deny biology, of course, is there are some of those differences. They're simply statistical. They're not absolutistic differences, but they are statistical. And those really are real. And what feminists, again, because of certain historical previous conditions, feminists are afraid that whenever you recognize a difference between men or women, that will be the source of oppression. That toxic masculinity will use any difference to get rid of femininity. Mm-hmm. That itself, which we can talk about, is the product of toxic femininity. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the main problems that we have to deal with. So there are, as in almost all areas, there have been some books out that attempt to create an integral feminism. And I certainly applaud those approaches. Mm-hmm. They get an awful lot of blowback from approaches that are just quadrant absolutistic or just recognize one of the many dimensions of a fully integral framework. Yeah. And that's always a problem. But you can,
and that's true for like every integral domain across the board, right? Whether you're talking about integral art and aesthetics or integral X, you're always going to get pushback from the quadrant absolutists.
Yeah, it is. And often from almost any first tier perspective. Of course. But the choice really is these factors are there, and you really just have two choices. You can take them into account or you can ignore them. And if you ignore them, what you're saying is, I'm going to approach this topic in a deliberately partial and fragmented way because I think that's the way to do it. And I go, well, fine, good luck with that. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's been one of the problems with feminism, why it sort of keeps going from first wave to second wave to third wave to struggling with the fourth wave. And they can never settle down because they're just bouncing off quadrants and bouncing off different factors that they're going to emphasize and then different factors that they're going to ignore or try to rule out. And that just won't get you very far. In a sense, a little bit problematic that the predominant form of feminism today is a broken green feminism. And that does tend to deny biology. It does tend to maintain that all masculinity is toxic. It doesn't give much of an account of toxic femininity. Although, again, you can always find much more open-minded and broad-minded feminists that do try to take those into account. And I'll actually read a quote from a couple of feminists on their discussion of toxic femininity and what that means, because it certainly is present. And again, the point is that not all femininity is toxic, not all masculinity is toxic.
That's right.
The whole idea that there could be a women's liberation movement, again, is something that arose only with the modern rational industrial era. Previous to that time, there were very few women that, because of their culture, however you want to take it, but very few that actually wanted to compete with men in the public sphere. In certain cases where they did so, for example, in monarchy, there were often women who were queens, from Russia to Britain. But by and large, it really didn't become an issue until the modern industrial era arose. And this wasn't so much a battle of masculine versus feminine as it was a battle between industrial and agrarian.
Right.
And again, that tends to be an aspect of the discussion that keeps getting left out, that a lot of the things that we have trouble with today were inherent in previous stages of development, including slavery. And we really have to keep that in mind, because otherwise we get the idea that all of the injustices of today are intentionally and deliberately perpetrated by choice, free choice in today's world.
Right.
Most of them aren't.
Right.
Most of them are holdovers from really lesser evolved stages, where things really were just inherently brutal. And one of the things Jordan Peterson keeps complaining about feminism is even defining today's world as a tyrannical patriarchy overlooks the fact that through most of human history, men and women worked together, and the enemy was just the brutality of natural existence itself. Yeah. I mean, average lifespans in previous eras went from around 23 years, average lifespan of the earliest tribes, to into 30 years or so with agrarian, 40 years or so with industrial, and then in the late industrial, an increase of 3 decades of average lifespan. So a whole lot of things that were created in earlier eras and is still here, including, for example, monogamous marriage. Mm-hmm. Those just have really just started to unspin. And when we started to see a rise in things like feminism, just as often, because it really was an attempt to loosen up fixed agrarian roles for both men and women, that men tended to join in on feminist movements often more than women joined in. So even up to the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, as an amendment to the Constitution in America, majority of men voted in favor of it. Majority of women voted against it, and it didn't pass. Right. That wasn't men oppressing women. That was women going, fuck that. I don't want to go to war. I'm not going to hell with you. And they already knew that they had an enormous number of privileges in terms of rights and values. So we don't hear about that.
Right.
So we really do want to take that kind of factor into account.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. Should we jump into the question about toxic masculinity and femininity?
Sure.
Okay.
One of the one of the problems is that with almost any kind of capacity that human beings have, you can have healthy and functional forms, and you can have unhealthy and dysfunctional forms. And some of those can get fairly nasty. And we tend to go back and forth culturally in terms of how men and women, interact with each other. We do have some undeniable statistical average differences between men and women in certain areas, including things like sexual behavior and sexual number of partner preference between men and women. And for evolutionary reasons, those evolved to be pretty different. Things like the Me Too movement are largely women complaining about men's behavior, and very rarely vice versa. For a million years, in terms of evolutionary unfolding, if a woman got pregnant, she's won the Darwinian lottery. She's passing on her genes, and she knows it. Now, the man doesn't know for sure whether he actually is the father or not. He assumes she's telling him the truth, but it not always turn out to be that way. But it is the case that for the entire period that the woman's pregnant, engaging in sex won't get her any more of a winner. She's already won that lottery. Having more sex isn't going to affect it at all. But for the man, having more sex is to his advantage. The more sex he keeps having, the better he gets a chance of winning the Darwinian lottery. So, of course, men developed an enormous preference for more number of sexual partners on average, than women do. And there are really hysterical studies of this. One was a group of attractive-looking people went around on a college campus and went up to men and up to women and would invite them with a series of questions. Could I call you all the way down to things like, would you like to go over to my apartment right now? The number of women that, the number of women that said, well, yes, you could call me was like, 40, 50%. The number of women that would go over to a man's apartment that afternoon was like 5%. The number of men that would go over to a woman's apartment was like 75%. But it's just
welcome to Tinder.
all over the place. It's really sort of hysterical. And it does mean that at every age, men and women have to come up with agreed upon patterns of how they're going to interact, because it's very different impulses operating here. And the tendency of men is, yes, to hit on women and always, be annoying them for sexual desires and so on. And you really do have to come up with a set of rules for how to do that. And it's one of the problems that we're facing now, along with the continued polarization, retribalization of culture, is men and women, particularly starting with the Me Too movement, have had to renegotiate how they're going to interact. And we haven't got that one figured out for this culture yet. And it's a real problem. And it's also the whole Me Too movement is predicated on the fact, well, it used to be in like the 50s that the most common response to a woman claiming that she was raped or otherwise sexually assaulted was to generally not really believe the woman, to think that she brought it on herself or she asked for it. That was just a very common response. It was extremely difficult for women, but it was relatively common. And then the whole implicit point of the Me Too movement is gone from women always lie to women never lie.
Right.
You should believe every single claim that any woman makes because that's the truth. There were statistics released in the early 70s, and I don't know how they've been updated now, but actually this is in the early 80s after DNA testing had been developed. And they looked at the number of men who were convicted of rape and found and had DNA evidence and found that fully 1 out of 3 of them were innocent. And these are people in prison. It's really a horrifying thought that somebody could lie about something like that and put somebody in prison. But it's pretty definitive evidence. So it's clearly not the case. Well, it's certainly not true that women always lie, but they don't always tell the truth either.
That's right.
And it's the same with men.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Ken, I think Believe All Women was an effort to try to create an opposition to toxic masculinity. And all it did was open the floodgates for toxic femininity.
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the real problems with, again, pluses and minuses about both sexes, the whole point of the fact that they are biologically different sexes is that in the upper right quadrant, those are real differences. Mm-hmm. And with certain extremely rare sort of confusion of genetic material, human organisms are either XX or XY. And that exhausts the options. Right. Those two, that's it. And that's real. Now, again, it's different in all the other quadrants. So we don't just take that alone, but we don't deny it either. Yep. And it really is a problem. And just because of some of those statistically inherited differences that go with XX and XY, such as XY has more interest in things and XX has more interest in people, and probably just because of the maternal nurturing role of having to constantly be aware of an infant and respond to it, people to people, versus men out trying to kill things with bow and arrows and stuff like that. Right. But there are differences, and those are real. And the thing is, whatever the tendencies that men and women have, those can go sour and they really can go toxic, but it happens with both of them, and it can be a real problem. Yeah. And some of the feminists have acknowledged this and have written on it. I've just today was reading an article by Sheena Shreen Even and Linda Weinberger, and it was something they called Machiavellian Mary, which was toxic femininity. And they said that some of the worst, most unpleasant bosses that they had worked for were female. And this is sort of a variation of what Barbara Streisand said, which is the real problem in Hollywood is women against women. So this is what they're talking about. And they said that businesses that were run by what they call Machiavellian Marys promoted dissension, suspicion, and distrust. They lowered morale, caused employee strife, damaged productivity, contributed to lawsuits, and jeopardized solvency. And this is an actual toxic femininity that's taking certain feminine characteristics and twisting them in a very monologically power-driven way. And that's a real problem. And one of the problems that we've seen, and I really only discovered this a few years ago, and in some ways, I'm still shell-shocked because I never, ever thought along these lines, never really had an understanding of what was happening. But it's the study of what happens when families are split and children are raised by single moms. And the studies on that, it's now been, the evidence is simply overwhelming. The studies just kept coming in and kept coming in and kept coming in. And the simplest way to state it is that you can look at a large number of the problems that teenagers start having and will stretch through their life are 60 to 70% higher in single mom families. Now, Warren Farrell, for example, in The Boy Crisis, and one thing about Warren Farrell is he always has empirical evidence for what he says. He's one of the most empirically grounded theorists that I know of. And he includes the conclusion of over 70 characteristics in men and women that demonstrably test in single mom families considerably lower than either mom and dad families, or in many cases, strangely, single dad families. Both boys and girls do better with single dads than single moms.
Interesting.
Including things like development of empathy. Single mom families have low levels of empathy in both their boys and girls, about 60% lower. Here's just 5 or 6 of some 70 factors that that we have evidence on. It's just alarming, actually. 80% of kids in psychiatric hospitals, single mom. Ironically, father-present kids have higher measurable capacity for empathy. Mom-only kids have significantly higher suicide rates than any other cause, including drug addiction. Mom-only kids across the board have lower IQs. 71% of high school dropouts are mom-only kids, 71%. They are 66% more likely to be hospitalized for any reason. A staggering 90% of homeless and runaway kids are mom-only families. Mom-only kids are more likely to be victims of child abuse, major violence, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Youth in prison, 85% are mom-only families. A majority of substance abuse, 65% mom-only families. Again, it's almost any, anger-driven rapes, 80% mom-only families. And almost all school shooters, mom-only families. Now, there's been a lot of questions about why does that happen? And even things like empathy. Why is empathy higher with even dad-only families than mom-only families? And one of the reasons, some of them are ironic. Dads, for example, will tend to be less empathetic than a mother will be. Mm-hmm. But what that does is it forces the kid to actually have to work harder to understand what's happening with their dad. So they develop a more empathetic sensitivity than kids that their moms just automatically get it. If you take, studies have shown, another example of that, if you take some clearly underage kids, put them in front of a liquor store and ask adults coming in, they give them money, say, would you buy me some liquor? And in one study, they had about 20 women do it, about 20 men. All but one of the women said yes. Not one of the men said yes. So the men are really, they set boundaries and they enforce those boundaries. And moms have trouble doing that.
Yep.
And for a lot of those, like I say, fairly paradoxical reasons. But the more I became aware of that type of statistic, first of all, it bothered the liberal in me enormously. It's just something that I had never considered. And certainly starting in the 60s and 70s, single moms were celebrated. I mean, Murphy Brown famously had her child. So much so that the semi-idiotic vice president at the time criticized her and was just overwhelmed with negative feedback for doing that. Republican vice president.
Right. Well, Ken, just real briefly, it's interesting. I've talked to Keith Witt about this, how, because in the 1980s, divorce rates spiked. They really hit like an all-time high. And pop culture actually reflected this, because there were a huge, massive run of shows in the early and mid 80s that all featured a single male father, and oftentimes a single female mother as well. But it was very often the single male, and it was usually the mother had died or they got a divorce. And you saw this everywhere from like Full House to Little Wonder. I mean, there was any number of these shows that featured just one parent. And that was culture actually, in a sense, catching up with what was happening in the lower right quadrant and trying to reflect that back to us. And basically, I think it was largely an effort to make kids feel like, guys, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, here's the alarming statistic that goes with the problem with single mom families. By the way, Warren Farrell, in an attempt to not unduly put a judgment on women, he refers to the families instead as dad deficient. So how are you going to look at it? Here's the problem. In 1960, 5% of white families were single mom, 5%. That's gone today to close to 40%. Here's the really alarmer. In 1960, about 20% of black families, single mom. Today, it's approaching 75%. That's a guarantee that 75% of those kids are going to have 60 to 70% homelessness, addiction, criminality, be in prison. And it's never talked about. You're not even allowed to mention that as a problem. That's green gone insane.
Yeah. Because
it's just so worried about offending anybody by saying something like that. It's ignoring the problem that's producing 60 to 70%.
Yep.
Catastrophic.
Yep. Human. And unwilling to examine interior causes for these things. They only want the exterior, policy fix.
We've already said there is a toxic masculinity. I basically already blamed every war human beings have ever gotten into on it. And it's essentially the case.
Yeah.
But there is toxic femininity.
Totally.
And the only disaster about these kinds of broken green discussions is the absolutely partial and limited number of factors that it considers real. So again, not individual sovereignty, but group sovereignty. Not that everybody, not that we are consistently stopping marginalization and oppression, and that has happened to a stunning degree, but that every white person has white privilege and is oppressing every minority it can. On and on and on. They're taking extraordinarily small slices of the pie. And that doesn't help, because the factors that are really having an impact on this are not getting addressed. And that's absolutely horrifying. And yet, in some cases, the factors that have actually created the capacity for egalitarian cultures, like I said, that original white, cisgendered, heterosexual, male European, for whatever reason, and frankly, in this case, I don't give a rat's ass who they conquered or oppressed or colonialized. Everybody around the world had oppressed and conquered other people. Only one culture came up with the principles that would give equality to all people. Only one. That's not somebody that you have to point a finger at and say, you're the devil. Sorry, that won't work.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of absolutely skewed and imbalanced and limited judgment that's driving so much of broken green. And that's what makes them so problematic, precisely because they're the leading edge. That's why they're more accountable than just some idiot at an amber ethnocentric white supremacist. We expect that kind of idiocy from that kind of thing. We don't expect it from the leading edge of culture with a multiplistic fourth person perspective that should know better than this shit, but doesn't.
Right. Oh man, that's awesome. Well, Ken, just a couple random thoughts before we close. First off, as you were talking about male and female sexual behaviors, it reminded me of, I often think about this in terms of like our sexual behaviors on the human level often seems to me like a recapitulation of what's happening on the cellular level.
Yeah.
Like, in other words, a woman is born with like 100% of the eggs that she's going to need throughout her life. And each of those eggs kind of patiently waits until one gets dropped down the tube. And then from there, it just sits there and waits for millions of sperm, all of which were literally born yesterday, compete, right, to be so basically chemically selected by the egg. And then, that's where babies come from. And it always seems like, when you start looking at how people, I've never used Tinder, but when I see how people describe Tinder, it's like, oh, it's the sperm and the egg problem, just recapitulating itself all over again. And second, when we're talking about privilege, I think that, one of the things that really gives me a lot of clarity, I'm sorry, not privilege, when we're talking about toxic masculine and toxic feminine, one of the things that gives me a lot of clarity is, first off, there's a section of your Integral Vision book where you actually use the words sick boy, sick girl, which to me is just a reframe of various types of toxicity and how toxicity can manifest different for different typologies. But then there's also the developmental play where, you and David Data have often talked about stage 1 masculine and feminine, stage 2 masculine and feminine, stage 3 masculine and feminine. I think so much of what we identify as toxic behavior generally exists at stage 1 and stage 2. And that's not even to say that those first two stages themselves are inherently toxic, but they can get really broken really fast. And on Reddit, for example, which is, one of the bigger social media sites out there, there are subreddits. One subreddit is called Nice Guys, which is, people posting screenshots of conversations that really express toxic masculinity. Usually it's like the whole, like, I was nice to you and I opened the door for you. Why won't you fuck me? Right. That's the kind of toxicity it often manifests as. And then there's another subreddit called Nice Girls, where it's the exact same behavior, but, coming from sort of that different typology. So they're both, definitely very real. And so to close, Ken, once again, thank you so much for your time. We're almost at the 4-hour mark.
Okay.
This has been absolutely incredible. Thank you for just all of your energy and all of your care here. And I hope for everyone listening, I hope you really experienced this. I think, Ken, this was in most ways a love letter to liberalism. As you say, we're often a little bit harder on the left than we are the right because they should fucking know better. But, I think in this conversation, we've done a really good job of identifying what the healthy sort of contributions of the green altitude and of leftism in general are, while also kind of tracking how they got so corrupted and toxified. And I really hope
just a quick footnote on that, then please continue.
Yeah.
But that's important precisely because green is the leading edge right now. We're not going to get to second tier except going through green. Right. And if green is going to take every person that's evolving and moving to these even greater, more comprehensive stages, and it's going to be broken and twist them that way, that's not good. That's why I'm much more concerned with what's going wrong there than I am with all the idiocies of the lower stuff, even though that's absolutely catastrophic and can be much more vicious in its own way. But that's not the real cultural concern right now. The cultural concern is how the leading edge is badly tilted. And that's such an issue. We've got to address that. And they've got to start to have that understanding so that more people can continue onward.
Beautifully said. I've got nothing else to say because you just said it all. Ken, thank you so much, man. Okay. And everyone, tune in next month. We'll be doing it again. And until then, Ken Wilber, I'm Corey DeVos. Thank you so much for joining us. And We'll catch you on the flip side.
Thank you,
Bye,
Ben.
Ken.